Ammianus Marcellinus described the Huns as a people scarcely mentioned in earlier records, dwelling beyond the Maeotian marshes near the frozen ocean, surpassing all others in savagery. He made no attempt to trace them back to the distant interior of Asia, nor did he connect them with the barbarian peoples known to classical writers. In fact, their name was so unfamiliar that he could only state that they first appeared to history in the lands north or northeast of the Sea of Azov, living close to the northern seas. He did not even attempt to guess why they had left this homeland. Where Ammianus had refrained from speculation, Eunapius did not. A tale explaining the arrival of the Huns quickly spread through Byzantine historical literature and was repeated for centuries by writers such as Sozomen, Zosimus, Priscus, Jordanes, Procopius, Agathias, and later chroniclers like Simeon the Logothete, Cydranus, and Nicephorus Callistus in the 14th century. According to this story, the Goths and the Huns lived side by side, separated by the Straits of Kerch, without even knowing of each other's existence. Each believed there was no land beyond the horizon. Then, by chance, a heifer belonging to the Huns was stung by a gadfly and fled across the marshy waters. Its herdsmen followed, discovered habitable land, and returned with the news. In another version, hunters pursuing a stag crossed the straits, found fertile country, and brought word back to their people. Whether driven by a cow or a deer, the Huns eventually crossed in force and fell upon the Gothic settlements of Crimea. The tale, however, was no genuine tradition, but rather a literary invention. Eunapius himself admitted that no one could give a clear account of the Huns' true origins or of the land from which they came when they began their conquest of Europe. He first relied on the old stories, which in fact meant poetry rather than history. And here he adapted the myth of Io as told by Aeschylus, who had crossed the same strait pursued by a gadfly. Later, Eunapius revised his opinion when actual reports about the Huns reached him. The popularity of the tale, however, ensured its survival for centuries, even though it shed no real light on the attack on Crimea. At most, it reveals that, in the early 5th century, no one actually knew how the Huns had first come into conflict with the Ostrogoths. In his efforts to satisfy curiosity, Eunapius also tried to link the Huns with various peoples mentioned by earlier authors. Zosimus reports that he suggested they might be the royal Scythians or the snub-nosed men from Herodotus, or else that they had originated somewhere in Asia before crossing into Europe. Philostorgius adds another theory, identifying them with the Nebroi, a mythical tribe said to live on the fringes of Scythia. In this way, Eunapius offered at least 4 different explanations, 3 of them drawn from Herodotus. He may not have solved the problem of their origins, but he certainly provided his readers with a range of possibilities, enough to satisfy all but the most skeptical. Although Eunapius and those who followed him shaped much of later thought on the Huns, other interpretations were not absent. Orosius, for example, placed them near the Caucasus and claimed that their sudden appearance was no mystery at all. To him, they were released from their mountain fastnesses by divine will, unleashed upon the Goths and Romans as a just punishment for human sin. Many Christians likely shared this belief. Jerome, another influential Christian, turned back to Herodotus and identified the Huns with those Scythians who once held the East in bondage for 20 years and even demanded tribute from Egypt and Ethiopia. Procopius added another layer of speculation, declaring that the new invaders were none other than the ancient Cimmerians. As time went on, efforts to solve the puzzle grew increasingly extravagant. Constantine VII thought Attila was really a king of the Avars, whose conquests laid the foundations of Venice. Constantine Manasses, a poet rather than a historian, claimed that Sesostris of Egypt had once allied with the Huns, settled them in Assyria, and renamed them Parthians. John Tzetzes in the 12th century went even further, asserting that the Huns had fought in the Trojan War, brought to Troy by Achilles himself, along with Bulgars and Myrmidons. Such later inventions aside, the earlier speculations deserve closer thought. Did Eunapius and others genuinely believe the Huns were identical with the Nebroi or the Simoi mentioned by Herodotus? Did one of the great bishops of the 5th century truly accept tales that the Huns devoured their own parents? It is doubtful. In reality, few writers sought direct knowledge of the steppe or of the nomads who dwelled there. A handful of figures like Ammianus or Olympiodorus held themselves to slightly higher standards, but most historians and their audiences were less interested in factual accuracy than in demonstrating their command of the classics. Mastery of ancient authors was what separated the educated from the barbarian masses. As Libanius remarked to the young Julian, if their literature perished, they would be no different from barbarians. A century later, Sidonius wrote that when official ranks and honors had disappeared, the only true mark of nobility was learning. Thus, to compare the Huns to the Massagetae, to describe them in the language of Herodotus or Thucydides, was not simple credulity, but a display of cultured identity. The Goths, however, lacked such a classical foundation. Instead, they preserved a folk tale, later repeated by Jordanus. In this story, a Gothic king named Philomer, ruling 5 generations after the migration from Scandinavia, discovered witches among his people, called Haliorunai in their tongue. He drove them into the Scythian wilderness, where wandering spirits coupled with them and brought forth the Huns, a race described as vicious, small, wretched, and half-human. This tale surely reflected the horror of the Goths when faced with the savagery of their conquerors. Set against this mass of speculation, the restraint of Ammianus is striking. He merely wrote that the Huns were a people scarcely known to earlier writers, living beyond the Maeotian marshes near the frozen ocean, and that they surpassed every extreme of ferocity. Writers of the late Roman world often adapted their accounts depending on the audience they addressed. Historians writing for the educated elite preferred to use the familiar names recorded by classical authorities, like Herodotus or Thucydides, rather than the strange-sounding names of contemporary tribes. In contrast, those who aimed their works at monks or ordinary readers avoided such obscure references. For them, it made more sense to speak of Huns or Gepids, peoples everyone feared and recognized, than of half-forgotten groups from distant antiquity. This habit explains why John Malalas and other popular chroniclers could describe Lucius Verus or the Emperor Carus as having died fighting the Huns, or why another anonymous source claimed Constantine the Great crossed the Danube to conquer them. Such accounts clearly belong to the realm of invention rather than fact. Earlier scholarship also sought to link the Huns with tribes mentioned in ancient geographical works. Some once argued that when Dionysius Periegetes listed peoples such as the Tocheroi and Frunoi alongside the Seres of the Far East, the Frunoi were in fact the Huns. This interpretation has now been dismissed. Scribal errors also added to the confusion. Dionysius once referred to the Ulatai, living near the Caspian Sea, but later copyists altered the name into something more familiar, which misled readers into equating them with the Huns. More weight has been given to a passage in Ptolemy, who mentions a group called the Chuni, living between the Basternae and the Roxolani. On this basis, some claim that the Huns were already settled in the Pontic region in the 2nd century, perhaps between the Bug and the Dniester rivers. Yet it is difficult to believe that they could have lived there unnoticed for 200 years, especially so close to peoples well known to the Romans. If they truly were neighbors of the Bastarnae and Roxolani, why did their sudden appearance in the late 4th century provoke such shock? Moreover, if they were really the forebears of the Huns, it is odd that Ptolemy placed them in a region far removed from the Kuban Basin, which was unquestionably their homeland when they first encountered the Goths. The similarity between the names Chuni and Huns may simply be coincidence. It is also striking that while Western Roman writers used the name with a guttural "cheech," Eastern authors never did so. As for the claim made by Sikh that Persians and Romans had already met the Huns in 363, this too should be rejected. In that year, Emperor Jovian concluded a controversial peace with Shapur of Persia. The treaty required both empires to fortify the passes of the Caucasus against barbarians unknown to both us and the Persians. These unnamed enemies were not the European Huns of later fame, but the Kidarites, or so-called Black Huns, who would trouble Persia throughout the following century. The true origins of the European Huns and their movements before the final decades of the 4th century remain just as obscure to us today as they were to Ammianus in his own time. In 376, reports reached the Roman commanders along the Danube that massive disturbances had broken out among the northern tribes. Word spread that peoples from the plains between the Tisa and the Black Sea were in flight, driven from their homes by a ferocious new enemy whose sudden appearance filled the region with terror. At first, the Roman officers dismissed these rumors. From long experience, they assumed such tales of barbarian wars beyond the frontier would fizzle out as they usually did. Yet the warnings grew more urgent, and then the first desperate refugees arrived on the river's northern bank, begging to be allowed into the safety of Roman territory. As days passed, the numbers swelled into a vast crowd, pressing on the Danube's edge. The officers could no longer doubt what was happening. The Gothic kingdom of Ermanaric had collapsed before the onslaught of the Huns. The Alans had already been subdued before the Goths met their fate. These nomadic horsemen roamed east and west of the Don River, their herds moving with the seasons. They had no temples, but venerated a naked sword planted upright in the ground as a divine symbol. In the past, they had raided the Bosporan cities of Crimea and struck into Armenia and Media, earning a reputation as fierce and unconquerable. Yet the Huns had broken them. Though the details are lost, what is clear is that many Alans were slaughtered before the survivors accepted subjection. Not long after 370, the Huns, now reinforced by Alan contingents, turned against the wealthy Ostrogothic realm that stretched from the Don to the Dniester and north to the Pripyat marshes. They began with probing raids, but soon hurled their full strength at the kingdom. Ermanaric, the aging king, unnerved by the reports of Hunnic savagery, tried to hold firm, but eventually took his own life. His successor, Vithamiris, hired some Huns as mercenaries to fight against their own people, and with his Gothic followers faced the invaders in repeated battles. Each time, he suffered heavy defeat. At last, after barely a year on the throne, he was killed in a battle said to have taken place on a river somewhere between the Dniester and Dnieper. Most of the Ostrogoths submitted to the Huns. Later, Gothic traditions tried to disguise this as a voluntary decision to withdraw, but in truth, it was a crushing conquest. Vithamiris' child son, Videricus, was left as a figurehead, while two commanders, Elathius and Saphrax, led the remnants of the army. Despite their bravery, the Goths were steadily forced back behind the Dniester. This brought the Huns to the frontier of Athanaric, the judge and leader of the Visigoths. Determined to resist, he fortified his position along the Dniester, not far from where Aetius and Saphrax were holding out. To monitor the enemy, he sent a nobleman named Mundric ahead with a sizable force to watch the frontier and screen the army's preparations. The Huns, however, quickly grasped that this detachment was only a fraction of the Gothic host. Moving with astonishing speed through the night, they bypassed Mundrich, forded the Dniester behind him, and fell suddenly upon Athanaric's unsuspecting camp. The Gothic army collapsed in confusion and scattered into the Carpathian foothills with little resistance. Aetius and Saphrax, it seems, were overwhelmed at the same time. Athanaric then attempted to construct a defensive wall between the Pruth and the Danube. The fortifications were built with urgency and skill, but once more the Huns struck unexpectedly. The Goths narrowly avoided a massacre only because the enemy, slowed down by plunder, could not exploit their surprise as effectively as usual. Even so, panic spread. Confidence vanished, and the Visigoths began abandoning Athanaric. With families and possessions in tow, they drifted southward toward the Danube. Beyond that broad river, they hoped to find safety in Thrace, shielded by Roman garrisons from the terrifying new people, a race never seen before, rising from some hidden corner of the earth and sweeping away everything in its path. As the multitudes gathered along the northern bank, Roman officers stationed opposite them on the south began to realize that the rumors they had once dismissed with contempt had been nothing less than the truth. In the autumn of 376, a vast body of Goths, estimated by contemporaries at nearly 200,000, was granted permission to cross the Danube. 2 years later, on the 9th of August, 378, they clashed with Emperor Valens on the plains near Adrianople in a battle that has often been compared to a second Cannae. A year before that decisive confrontation, in 377, the Goths had been trapped in the mountain passes of Hemus in Thrace, surrounded by Roman forces and on the brink of starvation. They seemed doomed. Yet a number of their warriors managed to slip through the Roman lines and reach groups of Huns and Alans roaming north of the Danube. Promising them rich plunder, the Goths persuaded these nomads to join them. The effect was immediate. Once Roman commanders heard of the alliance, they cautiously withdrew, and the Goths broke free, once again ravaging Thrace. This contingent of Huns appears to have remained with the Goths right up to Adrianople. After the great victory, when the Goths attempted unsuccessfully to storm Adrianople itself, these same allies were still by their side. It is entirely possible that the decisive cavalry charge at Adrianople included Hunnic horsemen as well as Gothic riders. The sources are silent, but the catastrophe was so overwhelming that no precise or reliable account survived of how the battle unfolded. In the immediate aftermath, Hunnic raiders took part in the devastation of the northern Balkan provinces. When Theodosius I was raised to the purple in January 379, he quickly faced bands of Huns, Alans, and Goths still plundering the region. In his first year, he claimed victories over them, though contemporary voices described the Huns as particularly savage in their destruction. Later writers even claimed that by 427, they had already occupied Pannonia for half a century. While debated, this fits with the evidence that within only a few years of Adrianople, Hunnic warbands were pressing toward Gaul, suggesting that much of eastern Pannonia had already fallen under their sway. Through the 380s and early 390s, they were rarely mentioned, though their menace was felt. In 395, they struck with full force. That winter the Danube froze, and Hunnic cavalry poured across into Roman territory. Thrace once again was laid waste, while Dalmatia feared an invasion. A rumor spread that Rufinus, the Praetorian prefect, had invited them in, but this was more likely political slander than fact. Rufinus, in reality, did what he could to relieve the suffering of the peasantry. The main Hunnic onslaught, however, was directed eastward. Sweeping through the Caucasus, they overran Armenia and pressed into the wealthiest provinces of the Eastern Empire. Cappadocia's villages burned, and panic spread as they advanced as far as the Halys River. Parts of Syria were devastated, and Antioch braced for a siege as the enemy's cavalry thundered along the Orontes. Herds of captives and livestock were driven north beyond the Caucasus. In Armenia, they reached Melitene, ravaged Euphratesia, and pushed into Coele-Syria and Cilicia. Jerome vividly described the terror of these raids. Wolves from the distant Caucasus descended with shocking speed, overwhelming provinces, slaughtering without pity, and dragging off captives. Antioch, Phoenicia, Palestine, and even Egypt trembled at the thought of invasion. Rumors swirled that they were marching on Jerusalem, lured by the city's wealth. Antioch hastily repaired its neglected walls. Tyre looked once again to the sea for safety, and coastal towns prepared ships in case flight was their only hope. Their speed was such that they outstripped rumor itself, appearing suddenly where least expected, sparing neither age nor status, cutting down even children who could not yet understand their fate. At this moment, the Roman army was absent, tied up in Italy by civil conflict. Eastern commanders were accused of cowardice or negligence, and for months no effective resistance was offered. Eventually, the eunuch Eutropius managed to gather a force of Gothic auxiliaries and scattered Roman troops to confront the invaders. Though he could not recover the enormous booty the Huns had carried off, he restored a measure of order by 398. The following year, in a remarkable display of imperial favor, the same eunuch entered office as consul. For more than a decade after their first great invasion, the Huns did not return to trouble the eastern provinces. But in the opening years of the new century, they appear to have driven westward through Central Europe, pushing other peoples before them from their new bases in the northern Balkans. The scenes resembled those of 376. In the winter of 405, the Gothic chieftain Radagaisus stormed into Italy, with contemporaries claiming, wildly, that he commanded 400,000 men, though the true number was far smaller. A year later, on the last day of 406, vast groups of Vandals, Suebi, and Alans broke across the frozen Rhine and into Gaul. These great migrations were the result of Hunnic expansion from the east, although our sources preserve only one faint reference to the battles that must have forced the Germans from their homes. Orosius remarks simply that in those years the Goths, the Alans, and the Huns tore one another apart in mutual slaughter. By 408, the attacks on the Danube provinces resumed. That year, the first Hun leader known by name appeared, Uldin. He crossed the river and seized Castra Martis, a fortress lying well inside the province of Moesia. The fort fell by treachery, though the identity of the betrayer is unknown. Uldin then poured through Thrace, and when the Romans tried to negotiate, he mocked their offers. Pointing eastwards to the rising sun, he declared that if he wished, he could subdue all the lands touched by its light. He demanded an impossible price for peace. The Roman commander, however, responded cleverly. He stalled the talks while quietly persuading Uldin's subordinate chieftains to abandon him, stressing the emperor's generosity and the rewards awaiting those who sided with Rome. Many Huns and their Syrian allies deserted, and Uldin barely escaped across the Danube with his life, leaving behind heavy losses. The Eastern authorities worked hard to prevent a repeat of such devastation. Herculius, Praetorian prefect of Illyricum and a patron of learning, was ordered to mobilize everyone, regardless of rank, for the rebuilding of walls and the delivery of food to the stricken regions. The emperor, guided by his prefect Anthemius, declared that no one could shirk the task. The burden must fall equally on the highborn and the low. The sense of urgency was palpable. Another raid could come at any moment. Anthemius went further, instructing that every approach to the empire, harbors, coasts, river crossings, even remote islands, be carefully secured against the savagery of the barbarians. The Danube fleet was strengthened by a strict program of shipbuilding begun in January 412, requiring the provinces of Moesia and Scythia to build or repair a fixed number of vessels each year until more than 200 were afloat. Local officials faced heavy fines if they failed to deliver. Anthemius's greatest accomplishment, however, was the construction of the massive new land walls of Constantinople, the Theodosian walls, completed by 413. Long planned but never realized, their urgency became undeniable after Uldin's raid. As Barry observed, Anthemius was consciously preparing for the Hunnic War he foresaw. The collapse of Uldin's power was followed by one of the more obscure episodes in Hunnic history. Priscus later heard the tale from a West Roman named Romulus, whom he met in Attila's camp in 449. According to Romulus, at some point in the early 5th century, the Huns, suffering famine at home while Rome was distracted by war, attempted an expedition against Persia. Two leaders, Basic and Cursic, led a large force across a desert, past a lake Romulus thought might have been the Sea of Azov, and after 15 days over some mountains into Persian territory. They plundered widely, but were met by a Persian army that filled the sky with arrows. Defeated, the Huns withdrew with little of their booty, taking a different route that may have led them through the oil-producing lands around Baku. The episode probably occurred between 415 and 420. In 420, war erupted between the Eastern Empire and Persia after Persian authorities seized Roman traders' goods, refused to return Roman miners they had hired, and began a persecution of Christians. As Roman troops were concentrated in the east, the northern frontier was stripped bare. In 422, the Huns took advantage, once again raiding Thrace. We have no details of the incursion or of how they were driven off, but it was the last major clash with the eastern provinces before the rise of Rua, Attila's uncle, who would bring the Huns onto the stage in even greater force. The early history of the Huns in Europe shows that they were not always the sworn enemies of Rome, the Goths, or even the Persians. From the very beginning they were divided, fighting both for and against those they encountered. This pattern continued for decades and was noted with a mixture of surprise and relief by contemporary observers. Theodosius I had managed to repel Hun raiders from the Balkans in his first year as emperor, but he also recruited them as allies. When he faced the usurper Maximus on the River Save in 388, his rapid cavalry victory was due largely to Hun horsemen fighting in his ranks. It is quite possible that in the same year, after Maximus' brother was defeated at Poetovio, Hunnic cavalry were responsible for much of the slaughter of the retreating troops. At the same time, in the west, Hun mercenaries were turned against the Juthungi in Raetia, showing that the nomads could be both menace and asset. The most prominent of the early Hun leaders was Uldin. He first rose to notice in 400, when the German rebel Gainas tried to cross into Asia Minor. Blocked by the imperial fleet, Gainas retreated to the Danube, where Uldin confronted him. Unwilling to tolerate an independent barbarian army on his doorstep and eager to prove his worth to Constantinople, Uldin fought Gainas in repeated clashes until he finally killed him. Gainas's head was displayed in Constantinople in January 401, and in return, Uldin received rich gifts and an alliance with the Eastern court, likely accompanied by tribute. His victory, however, was not his alone. Local magistrates and the citizens of Thrace had already taken strong defensive measures, fortifying their towns and moving livestock and supplies inside the walls. That spirit of civic defense would reappear decades later when Attila's forces were resisted at Asimus. Soon after, Uldin appeared in Western service. In 405, the Gothic warlord Radagaisus invaded Italy with a vast following, driving terrified cities into panic. Stilicho responded by enlisting Huns and Alans under Uldin's command. In the Battle of Faesulae, the Huns proved their value, starving Radagaisus' men of supplies and then executing a devastating outflanking charge. The enemy was annihilated, and Hun warriors sold their captives at the rate of a single gold coin per head. By 408, however, Uldin had turned against the Eastern Empire and invaded Thrace, beginning the cycle of raids that would continue for years. Yet both East and West still relied heavily on Hunnic manpower. After Stilicho's death, the Western Empire, desperate for reliable troops, turned again to the Huns. Hostages were exchanged, one of them being the young Aetius, who would later become Rome's greatest general. His time among the Huns was remembered by his supporters as crucial, since it supposedly taught him how to break the fury of the northern armies. In 409, when Alaric's brother-in-law Athalf advanced through the Julian Alps, Honorius's minister Olympius met him with just 300 Huns and inflicted heavy losses on his force. Later that same year, the imperial government brought 10,000 Huns into Italy from Dalmatia, a presence so intimidating that Alaric abandoned his immediate plan to march on Rome. By this time, the very name of the Huns struck fear into the strongest hearts. In 412, Eastern Rome also sought to control them through diplomacy. An embassy led by Olympiodorus crossed the Black Sea and nearly perished in a storm before reaching the court of a Hun ruler named Donatus. The Romans swore friendship with him, but then treacherously murdered him, perhaps fearing the growing strength of his kingdom. A successor, Carato, naturally resented this act, but was appeased with costly imperial gifts and promises of peace. Years later, in 425, during the struggle between the usurper John and the Eastern Empire, Aetius was sent to the Huns to hire troops. By the time he returned to Italy, John had already been killed, yet Aetius managed to use the Huns in battle against the Eastern commander Aspar. Although the fight was indecisive, Aetius persuaded the Huns to leave Italy, securing peace at the cost of gold and hostages. His feat was so highly regarded that Galla Placidia and her son Valentinian III restored him to favor, granting him the title of count. Contemporary accounts claimed he had dismissed 60,000 Huns, a testament both to their power and to Aetius's influence. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Huns had already earned a dual reputation in the Roman world. They were feared enemies, but they were also employed as useful mercenaries. Both Eastern and Western emperors recruited their horsemen into imperial armies, and wealthy individuals followed the same practice. Rufinus, the powerful prefect under Arcadius, kept a personal guard composed of Huns. while his great rival Stilicho also relied on them for protection. Stilicho's Hun retainers fought fiercely for him, and only after they had been cut down in a surprise night attack were his enemies able to move against him. The fact that such guards are recorded even in brief chronicles suggests that these units were not small, but sizable private armies. While some Romans valued them as protectors, many others saw only the terrifying side of the new arrivals. Stories circulated that the Huns murdered their own parents and swore oaths over their corpses. Half a century later, the bishop Theodoret repeated and exaggerated such tales, claiming they not only killed the old, but consumed their flesh. Writers of every sort portrayed them as savage beasts. Ammianus called them little better than two-legged animals. Jerome likened them to wolves. Jordanes described them as almost human. And Procopius later contrasted them with the white Huns, whom he considered unusually civilized. Even some Huns themselves, according to Zachariah of Mytilene, admitted that they were barbarians who lived like wild predators in the far north. The devastation they brought to borderlands was severe. The Goths suffered first when the nomads fell upon them with the suddenness of a storm from the mountains. In Thrace, monks recalled how roaming Hun bands forced them to abandon open settlements and build fortified refuges. Hypatius, who visited the region around 386, joined 80 brethren in constructing a stronghold so they could continue their devotions in relative safety. He later told how one of these fortresses was surrounded by Huns, but a single well-aimed stone hurled from an opening in the wall panicked the attackers, who turned and rode away. Afterward, destitute villagers who had lost everything in the raids flocked to the monastery seeking food. The abbot Jonas carried their pleas to Constantinople, and only then did Rufinus and other officials send grain by sea to alleviate the famine. Land routes were unsafe, and government resources were too limited to offer much help to remote frontier districts. Yet, despite their reputation, the Huns soon attracted the attention of the church. Missionaries went out to them even in the first decades after their arrival in Europe. Theotimus, bishop of Tomi on the Black Sea, visited them and was treated with awe, some calling him the God of the Romans. Stories were told of miracles, how he and his companions became invisible to a Hun raiding party through prayer, or how a warrior attempting to ensnare him with a lasso suddenly found his arm frozen in mid-air until released by the bishop's prayers. Such wonders were celebrated, though the historian recording them doubted their literal truth. What can be said is that Theotimus softened their behavior by offering hospitality and gifts, even if he made no real converts. At the same time, John Chrysostom, Patriarch of Constantinople, also sent out missionaries to the nomadic tribes along the Danube, tribes unmistakably identified as Huns. These attempts, however, had little impact. The greatest obstacle was language. While Gothic interpreters were readily found in the capital, very few Romans knew the Hun tongue, and suitable preachers were nearly impossible to acquire. The efforts of both bishops thus produced no mass conversions, but they show how quickly the Church sought to confront and engage this new power on the frontier. There were, however, optimists within the Roman Empire who believed that the Huns were already on the verge of conversion. Writing in 403, Jerome proclaimed with excitement that the Huns are learning the Psalms, only a few years after he himself had trembled at their approach in his cell at Bethlehem. A decade later, in 417, Orosius confidently declared that the churches of Christ were filled not only with Romans, but also with Huns, Suevi, Vandals, Burgundians, and many other newly converted peoples. Even in the age of Attila, Theodoret claimed that the Huns had abandoned their grim custom of killing the elderly because they had now been touched by the message of the gospel, and he listed them among those who benefited from the intercession of the martyrs. Yet beneath these hopeful claims lay a harder truth. By the mid-5th century, when Attila ruled at the height of his power, it was admitted openly that the Church's mission had failed. Salvian of Marseille still counted the Huns firmly among the pagans. In Spain, the poet Prudentius tried to soften their image, suggesting that their bloodthirsty nature had been curbed, for they no longer drank blood, he said. But even he could only look forward to the day when they might drink instead from the chalice of Christ. Long afterward, in the 6th century, accounts of their brutal behavior still horrified the world. Chroniclers recorded that Hun raiders violated nuns and butchered those who had taken refuge at church altars, acts so appalling that even other barbarian soldiers in Justinian's armies were repelled. It is possible that a few individual Huns, particularly those captured or living as exiles within Roman territory, embraced Christianity. But if such converts existed during Attila's lifetime, no record survives. Only later do we hear of cases such as Sunica, described by Zachariah of Mytilene as a Hun who had taken refuge with the Romans, been baptized, and risen to the rank of general in Roman service. Zachariah himself summed up the prevailing reality when he had the Huns speak of themselves as barbarians who, like ravenous wild beasts, reject God in the distant northwest. This was the enduring image of the Huns in Roman literature, a people defined by cruelty, feared for their violence, and largely untouched by the Christian faith. And it was not only the educated elite who thought this way. The peasants and townsfolk of the frontier provinces, whose homes were burned, whose fields were laid waste, and whose families were dragged into slavery, must have shared the same view. For them, the Huns were not an abstract menace, but a daily terror. Later generations of clerics and administrators would brand Attila as the scourge of God, a tool of divine punishment. Yet for the common people of the provinces, he was something far simpler and more immediate, the face of destruction itself. Before examining the rise of Attila, it is worth pausing to look more closely at the structure of Hunnic society, for their sudden appearance and equally swift disappearance cannot be understood without appreciating the foundations of their way of life. When Priscus crossed into their lands in 449, he entered a world that had not even existed a generation before his birth, and by the time he wrote his account, it had already collapsed. Their empire was not static, but intensely dynamic, and its extraordinary rise and fall can only be explained in terms of their society, rather than by attributing everything to the genius of a single ruler. Attila may have been a formidable leader, but the roots of Hunnic expansion lay deeper. The Huns lived in what can best be described as the lower stage of pastoral life. Their wealth and survival depended on large herds of domesticated animals, horses, cattle, goats, and above all, sheep, the true foundation of steppe existence. Clothing was made of linen, acquired through trade, or of animal skins stitched together, especially the skins of small fur-bearing creatures such as marmots, which were highly valued even in Roman markets. Their way of life was so harsh that garments were worn continuously until they fell apart, reminding later observers of how Mongols in another age were required to wear their clothes until they literally disintegrated. Goatskin leggings and round caps completed their simple dress. Food came mainly from the herds, but this was never enough on its own. Like other nomads, the Huns relied heavily on hunting and on gathering wild plants to supplement their diet. Such details suggest that gathering was far more important than casual remarks in our sources might imply. Agriculture was unknown to them. They neither sowed crops nor grew flax. Any linen they possessed must have been obtained by barter with settled neighbors. Their own economy was fragile and insufficient, forcing them into constant contact, whether peaceful or violent, with agricultural peoples on the edge of the steppe. This dependence meant that the Huns could not have moved in vast hordes, as they are often imagined. Their survival required wide stretches of pasture, and the herds of even a few families needed space. Instead of one great wandering multitude, small groups moved separately in search of grazing and water. A household of 5 or 6 people living in a single tent formed the basic unit. Several such households made up a camp. Camps formed clans. Clans together created tribes, and a cluster of tribes made up the larger people. A tribe might number a few thousand at most, but its members would often be scattered across the land in much smaller camps to protect their food supply. The social organization of the Huns reflected this scattered existence. Every man was required to tend animals or hunt, leaving little room for a leisured aristocracy to develop. There were no kings in the early period. Instead, each group followed its leading men in times of war, men whose authority rested more on personal influence and military reputation than on formal power. Leadership was temporary and practical, not hereditary or absolute. In peace, when families dispersed to their pastures, the influence of these leaders largely dissolved. Decisions of wider importance seem to have been taken in councils, where the heads of households gathered, often still on horseback, to discuss matters that concerned the tribe as a whole. Thus, Hunnic society was fluid and resilient, shaped by the demands of the steppe and by the need to adapt constantly. Their lack of central authority did not prevent them from becoming a formidable force. On the contrary, their mobility, loose organization, and dependence on pastoral life created the conditions for sudden bursts of power that could overwhelm even the strongest of their neighbors. Ammianus does not explain clearly how property was held among the Huns, whether by individual ownership, by clans, or by families. Land itself could not be privately owned, for this was impossible in a pastoral society. The herds, however, appear to have been kept by households much like the later Mongols, who owned their own animals, tents, and equipment. It is reasonable to assume that prominent Hunnic leaders, such as Onagesius, controlled the possessions of their own households. Yet, if private property had been highly developed, one would expect it to have created a true ruling class in times of peace. Since the leadership of the Hunnic chiefs almost vanished outside of war, it is unlikely that wealth alone determined authority. Leadership was therefore not strictly hereditary, though the reputation of a father might still benefit his son when new leaders were chosen. Slavery seems to have existed, though in limited form. Its absence would surely have been noted if it had been entirely unknown. The slaves of the Huns likely performed menial tasks, such as helping during great hunts, tending animals, or serving in the stables. Their lives were harsh, and their masters could kill them without consequence. Priscus even records 2 crucified for murdering their masters. Slaves were probably acquired almost entirely through warfare, and there is no indication that native Huns were ever enslaved. This picture of Hunnic material life in the late 4th century leads directly to questions of numbers and military strength. Chinese sources about steppe peoples speak of enormous armies of 100,000 or even 400,000 men. But such claims are implausible. A primitive pastoral economy could not possibly feed so many fighters concentrated in one place, nor could society function if so vast a portion of its men were withdrawn from herding for an entire campaign season. Even later claims that Attila's people numbered several 100,000 raise the problem of how such a multitude could have fed themselves during their migration from the Cuban basin to Pannonia. The figures provided by Greco-Roman observers suggest a much smaller scale. In 409, Emperor Honorius employed 10,000 Huns against Alaric. Olympiodorus, who knew Hunnic life well, emphasized the extraordinary effort required to sustain such a force. Livestock and grain had to be transported from Dalmatia into Italy to feed them. Zosimus repeats that supplies of corn, sheep, and oxen were specifically requisitioned for their arrival. The very fact that historians recorded this detail shows how unusual it was, and how difficult it was to maintain so many Hunnic warriors together. Without Roman support, it is doubtful the Huns could have supplied such a body on their own, especially in a land already devastated by Radagaisus' invasion only a few years before. Later reports speak of 10,000 Huns under Octar, who fought the Burgundians, but by that stage entire agricultural populations were being compelled to support their new masters. Even then, the number may have been exaggerated to emphasize their threat. Ancient writers rarely gave accurate figures for barbarian armies, especially when these were operating beyond the Roman frontiers. It was almost impossible for them to obtain reliable information, and numbers were often shaped by rhetorical purposes rather than careful counting. Olympiodorus records that the Hun force which defeated Atholf's Goths in 409 numbered only 300. Considering the supply difficulties already described, this is the sort of figure one might expect. In later centuries, when the Huns reverted to a more fragmented tribal society, their armies usually ranged between 200 and 1,200 men. Even the expedition of Zabergan in 558, which sent panic through Constantinople with its 7,000 warriors, was seen as extraordinary. It is reasonable to assume that the raiding parties which harassed Roman provinces at the opening of the 5th century rarely exceeded 1,200 warriors. The same figure can be applied to the average Hun mercenary force employed by the imperial government. Eyewitnesses of nomadic life in Mongolia describe tribes moving in groups of several hundred tents, each of which could field roughly 1,000 fighting men. When raids were launched, some adult males would stay behind to guard the herds and families, meaning that the field strength of a tribe was about the size suggested above. Since a tribal unit likely numbered around 5,000 people in total, its fighting force would naturally amount to a few hundred to 1,000 warriors. This helps explain why Hun contingents, whether attacking the Romans or hired as auxiliaries, appeared in numbers that correspond to tribal levies rather than vast armies. Each tribe operated with considerable independence, often in rivalry as much as in alliance with its neighbors. This tribal structure explains why some Huns could be found attacking Gothic forces while others were fighting on the Gothic side, why they alternately defended and threatened the Roman Empire, and why they were notorious for breaking treaties, since a pact made by one tribe never bound another. It also clarifies why no large-scale battles between Huns and Romans were reported for many years after their first arrival across the Danube frontier. This casts doubt on the famous claim that Aetius brought 60,000 Huns into Italy in 425. Such a force would imply a total population of at least 250,000, which is far beyond what any single Hun confederation could provide. Neither Aetius nor the Western Empire had the means to pay or feed so many mercenaries. The figure is best understood as a gross exaggeration. In reality, his force was probably closer to 1/10 of that number. Like many commanders, Aetius likely inflated his army's size for propaganda. Moreover, the astonishing mobility of steppe cavalry always made them appear far more numerous to observers than they truly were. The best sources, such as Priscus, rarely attempt to provide precise figures even in Attila's day. He simply says that Margus was taken by a large force of barbarians, or that Asimus resisted an overwhelming force. Descriptions of Attila's camp speak of a multitude surrounding his tent, or basic and cursic, leading a huge force. Such terms are elastic and imprecise. Later writers claimed that Attila's host at the Great Battle of 451 numbered 500,000 men. But this number, even if Priscus entertained it, was marked as a conjecture. It is unlikely that Attila himself could have known the exact size of his forces, and just as unlikely that he resisted the temptation to exaggerate. When compared with what is known about other nomadic empires, the conclusion is clear. The vast conquests of the Huns were achieved not by overwhelming numbers, but by relatively small, mobile bands of horsemen whose speed and ferocity created the illusion of countless hordes. The victories of the Huns were never the result of overwhelming numbers. Their strength lay instead in their arms, their mobility, and the terror they inspired. Contemporary observers wrote of the horror that swept through southeastern Europe at their arrival, noting that they froze the blood of all who beheld them. Far from being dismissed as just another barbarian tribe, the Huns struck fear even in an age well accustomed to Germanic invasions. Centuries later, writers still recorded the unique terror their presence inspired. It is striking that Roman and Gothic authors, when describing the Huns, so often began with their appearance. Ammianus wrote that they were so grotesque and bent in form that they resembled rough carvings or even two-legged beasts. Claudian declared their bodies obscene to look upon, while Sidonius noted that even the faces of their infants carried an unnatural gruesomeness. Jordanes added that their swarthy faces seemed terrifying, their heads little more than shapeless lumps. Jerome summed it up simply. Roman soldiers were terrified by the very sight of them. Their features, combined with ragged marmot skin clothing, unsettled troops used to facing enemies who looked and dressed much like themselves. This psychological edge proved a weapon as real as any sword or bow, and its effects lasted for generations. Yet their true power came from the horse. The Huns all but lived in the saddle. Observers claimed they were glued to their mounts, unable even to walk properly on the ground, living, eating, and negotiating entirely from horseback. Attila himself was seen dining while mounted. Such horsemanship could never be matched by the Romans, whose agricultural economy prevented them from raising a comparable cavalry tradition. Nomadic life produced horsemen of a quality that settled peoples could only imitate with enormous cost, and Rome lacked the resources to sustain such efforts. The steppe horsemen's strength lay in their combination of speed, archery, and fearlessness. Their charges were sudden and unpredictable, their retreats deliberate and deadly, their arrows falling in dense clouds with uncanny accuracy. Roman infantry, already worn down by years of exploitation and poor morale, stood little chance. The Hun horses, though small and ungainly, were hardy and capable of great endurance. When mounted on captured Roman steeds, any weakness disappeared. With their mastery of horsemanship, lightning maneuvers, and disciplined volleys, the Huns shattered armies far larger than themselves. Their weaponry reflected both limitation and ingenuity. They carried iron swords, gained through trade or plunder, since large-scale metalworking was beyond the means of a pastoral society. Their arrows were often tipped with bone, yet used with deadly precision. In close combat, they relied not only on blades, but also lassos, with which they could entangle foes on foot or horseback. More than one story survives of warriors being ensnared by this simple but effective weapon. Above all, the hallmark of the Huns was their bow. It was short, powerful, and made from horn and spliced wood, ideal for use on horseback. Its range and accuracy astonished Roman observers. Aetius, who had lived among the Huns as a hostage, became himself a skilled horseman and marksman under their tutelage. Roman armies eagerly captured these bows and even began to imitate them. Manuals from the period note that Roman cavalry improved their equipment after the example of Goths, Alans, and above all, Huns, which almost certainly meant the adoption of the step bow. When combined with horses equal in performance to those of Rome, the occasional use of Roman armor, and the natural mobility of their nomadic society, the Huns gained a decisive advantage in both tactics and strategy. As one observer put it, the entire nation was a ready-made army, always prepared for war, capable of sudden raids, and living permanently on a war footing. The defeats suffered by the Romans at the hands of the Huns cannot be understood simply as the result of military superiority. Their victories were made easier because the empire was already divided from within. Just as the Mongols could not have conquered China without the resentment of populations who despised their own corrupt rulers, so too the Huns profited from the discontent within the Eastern Roman provinces. Around the year 400, when Thrace was in chaos after Gaius's death at the hands of Uldin, bands of runaway slaves and others who had abandoned their positions in the Roman social order began claiming they were Huns, raiding the countryside until they were defeated by the general Fravitta. They used the Hun name deliberately, for nothing caused greater fear among landowners and soldiers than the thought of these new nomads. More importantly, this episode reveals that the lower classes of the empire often welcomed the arrival of the Huns. For them, it promised escape from servitude and the chance to overturn an oppressive system. The betrayal of a fortress like Castra Martis in 408 was not an isolated act, but one of many such moments of treachery that made the empire's defenses dangerously fragile. The state of the Roman army only added to this weakness. The authorities did learn from their enemies. Roman cavalry equipment had been improved by copying the arms of Goths, Alans, and Huns, and there is reason to believe the powerful step bow was adopted by Roman horsemen. Manuals of later centuries even advised generals to strike the Huns early in the year when winter had weakened their horses. Yet, despite these insights, the empire's soldiers were ill-prepared to face enemies whose society lived perpetually in readiness for war. The Huns were poor in material terms and relied on the most primitive means of survival, but their military strength was immense. So long as they remained divided into tribes and clans wandering independently in search of pasture, they lacked the political unity to threaten the empire as a whole. But their constant hunger and hardship gave them every reason to raid the wealthy provinces of Rome, or, when convenient, to sell their services as mercenaries. Contemporary observers often remarked that they were consumed with an insatiable desire for gold and for the plunder of other people's goods. Even before Ammianus wrote his account of them, this situation was beginning to change. Gothic legend told of a king named Balamber, who supposedly led the Huns in their conquest of the Ostrogoths. Most historians agree he never existed, invented instead by the Goths to explain their defeat. What is certain is that the Huns did manage to subdue a large part of the Ostrogoths, which implies a force greater than any single tribe could raise. Ermanarich, Vithimiris, and Videricus could not have been defeated in turn by 1,000 horsemen alone. The evidence suggests that for a brief moment, several tribes formed a confederacy, combining their strength to overwhelm the Gothic kingdom. Minor raids had first been carried out by individual tribes, but when the rewards proved rich, the tribes united to mount a larger invasion. This confederacy, however, was short-lived, for no lasting alliance seems to have been formed, and Ammianus himself insisted that the Huns were not ruled by kings in his day. The first-named Hun leaders shed some light on how their society evolved. Uldin was active at the start of the 5th century. He killed Gainas in 400, fought alongside Stilicho in Italy against Radagaisus in 406, and by 408 was raiding Thrace. During this last campaign, many of his men were persuaded to defect after Roman officers offered gifts and promises, suggesting that Hun leaders commanded only by maintaining constant success. Fragments of later writers confirm that Hun groups had multiple chiefs, some called kings, with one recognized as the first king. When Donatus was assassinated, Carata was immediately appointed to replace him, showing that by 412 at least some Hun tribes had begun to treat kingship as a permanent office. Yet even so, these kings were not absolute rulers, but war leaders whose authority lasted only so long as they could secure plunder and protect their people's herds. The disappearance of Uldin after his defeat in 408 illustrates how swiftly a leader could lose his position once he failed to deliver. This raises the question of whether there was true continuity between the confederacies of Uldin, Donatus, Carato, and others. Some have imagined a single Hun empire stretching from the Carpathians to the Don, passed from one ruler to the next until it culminated in Attila. But this is unlikely. After their victory over the Goths, the tribes seem to have reverted to their earlier independence, each controlling its own share of subjugated peoples. Raids across the Danube or through the Caucasus in the late 4th century were not coordinated campaigns, but separate ventures by different tribes taking advantage of Roman weakness. Confederacies did form occasionally, but they were temporary alliances forged for a specific raid or campaign. There is no evidence of a centralized state existing continuously before Rua's time. Indeed, Gothic leaders like Thorismud were still able to wage wars independently around 418, something impossible if the Huns had already imposed a single, tightly controlled empire. Much uncertainty surrounds the figure of Uldin. Some historians have argued that he was responsible for the first great westward movement of the Huns in the early 5th century. Others suggest that he was the first to establish a Hun base along the Danube, opposite the town of Margus, and that it remained their seat of power until the 440s. Some even speculated that Rua and Oktar were his sons and direct successors. Yet closer examination shows that Uldin was not the ruler of a great empire, but a relatively minor leader. The fact that he sought employment with both the Eastern and Western Roman armies indicates that he lacked a secure position of power north of the Danube. His struggles against Gainas in 400 underline this weakness. He required several engagements before achieving victory, despite Gainas leading a force already shattered by Roman troops. This makes it clear that Uldin commanded only a fraction of the Huns. It is inconceivable that the family of a relatively unsuccessful leader could have held sway over all the tribes for half a century. It is more likely that the confederacies associated with Uldin, Donatus, and others were temporary alliances with little continuity, and that only around 420, if not later, did the coalition that Rua eventually led come into being. The harsh environment in which the Huns lived forced them to seek survival through raids. Their encounters with the wealthier agricultural societies along the Danube made this tendency even stronger. In times of drought, raids against the Goths or Romans could mean the difference between life and death. Early on, these attacks were carried out under the leadership of tribal chiefs, whose authority was limited to wartime. But once conflict became a permanent feature of Hun life, leadership evolved into something more stable, resembling kingship. Success in war allowed them to draw together larger numbers of warriors, and as their victories multiplied, these confederacies grew in scale. Even in the time of Uldin and Donatus, however, the older system of influential tribal leaders continued to exist within the larger groupings. It is therefore misleading to say that the Huns rose suddenly and then collapsed just as suddenly. Rather, Attila's dominance was the climax of a steady process that had been building strength for decades. The decisive shift in their history came when the Huns moved from the regions east of the Black Sea into what is now Ukraine. This was not merely a change of territory, but a transformation in resources. In the east, they could plunder only the Alans, nomads as poor and scattered as themselves. In the west, they encountered the Ostrogoths, who lived in prosperous agricultural settlements and possessed food surpluses. Seizing this wealth gave the Huns the means to sustain larger forces and accelerate their development as a society. Trade also played a part in this transformation, though it has been less emphasized in accounts of their rise and will be considered later. Interestingly, even a contemporary like Nestorius, who attempted to explain the Hun ascent, ignored trade entirely. He described how the Scythian peoples, once scattered into tribes and known only as raiders, eventually united into a kingdom. Once organized, he said, they grew so powerful that they rivaled and even surpassed the might of Rome. The surviving fragments of Priscus history begin in 434, the year when Attila assumed leadership of the Huns. His work gives us precious detail, but only in scattered pieces, leaving us with moments of clarity followed by long gaps of uncertainty. Where his testimony exists, events can be described vividly. Where it is missing, we are left to conjecture or silence. Moreover, his focus lay on the eastern frontier, so the history of the West often remains in shadow. In the early 420s, Rua rose to prominence as leader of the most powerful Hun confederacy yet seen. He did not rule alone, for the sources tell us he shared authority with his brother Oktar. A third brother, Mundiok, father of Attila and Bleda, is not mentioned as sharing in power. It seems each controlled his own portion of the people and their subject tribes, for true joint rule of a single territory was unknown among them. Oktar died before Rua, leaving Rua sole commander by 432, when he enters Roman history. That year, Aetius, defeated by Boniface near Ariminum, found himself in danger from political rivals. After an assassination attempt by Sebastian, Boniface's son-in-law, Aetius, fled through Dalmatia into Pannonia, seeking support from the Huns. He had been their hostage more than 2 decades earlier and had relied on them in 425. Now again they received him, but only in return for concessions. Just a few years before, Eastern Roman forces had retaken Pannonia Secunda, including the key city of Sirmium. In 433, however, Aetius ceded Pannonia Prima to the Huns as part of a treaty that secured their backing. His son Carpilio was even sent to them as a hostage, following his father's path. With Hun aid, Aetius regained his position in Italy. Whether Rua himself marched with forces into the peninsula is unclear, but no battle is recorded against the Gothic auxiliaries brought by Sebastian and the Empress Placidia. In the end, Aetius was restored with the rank of patrician, while Sebastian fled to Constantinople. For the next 15 years, the Huns posed no direct threat to Italy. On the contrary, contingents of their cavalry helped Aetius and the Gallic aristocracy to hold Gaul against its enemies. The Burgundians were among the first to feel the weight of this alliance. Driven across the Rhine by the Hun migrations of 405–6, they had been settled by Rome along the Middle Rhine, around Worms, Mainz, and Speyer. By the mid-400s and 30s, their growing population sought new lands, and under King Gundahar, they invaded the region of Trier and Metz. But in 435, they were defeated by Aetius and forced into peace. 2 years later, in 437, Aetius turned the Huns against them. The result was catastrophic. Some accounts speak of 20,000 Burgundians slaughtered, others of near annihilation. Gundahar himself was killed, and the kingdom of Worms came to an end after less than a generation. Survivors were resettled in Savoy in 443. The destruction was remembered with awe, mentioned by several chroniclers, and later provided the foundation for the epic of the Nibelungenlied. A further tradition preserved by the historian Socrates sheds light on older conflicts between Huns and Burgundians. He records that some Burgundians had remained east of the Rhine, between the river, the Main, and the Neckar. These Eastern Burgundians, known for carpentry, were repeatedly attacked by Hun raiders. In desperation, they converted to Christianity, hoping for divine aid. Their hopes were confirmed, for soon after, their enemy's leader Uptar died suddenly in the night from gluttony, leaving his 10,000 followers leaderless. A Burgundian force of only 3,000 then routed them, and from that moment, according to Socrates, the Burgundians embraced Christianity with zeal. Socrates dates the curious story of Uptar's death to the year 430, which makes the name immediately recognizable. Uptar was none other than Oktar, the brother of Rua. Oktar outlived Rua for a time, but it now seems clear that he died while leading a campaign somewhat east of the Rhine. The details of the account ring true. The fighting between Huns and Burgundians in that region, the use of Oktar's name, and the numbers involved in the clash. We can reasonably conclude that Oktar's men, numbering in the thousands, were caught off guard and defeated by the Eastern Burgundians, who also saw their conversion to Christianity as bound up with this victory. When the Huns later turned upon the Burgundian kingdom of Worms, their attack must have carried the memory of that earlier defeat. Why Aetius chose to unleash them, however, remains a deeper mystery. Among Aetius's officers in the campaign against the Burgundians was Avitus, later Emperor of the West. After the fighting, he retired to his estate near Clermont-Ferrand in Auvergne. His quiet was soon broken when Litorius, Aetius's chief lieutenant in Gaul, hurried past on his way to relieve Narbonne. Then besieged by the Visigoths under Theodoric I, Litorius' force was made up of Huns, most likely supplied by Rua. As they advanced, they behaved less like allies than marauders, plundering the countryside, burning homes, and spreading fear among the local population. One particularly violent warrior even killed a servant of Avitus without cause. Avitus, roused by the panic on his estate, armed himself, mounted his horse, and rode after the army. He met the offender in single combat and avenged the servant's death, though the host itself marched on undisturbed. At Narbonne, the Huns proved their worth. Each man carried provisions of wheat, and after breaking the siege with a ferocious charge, they brought much-needed supplies into the starving city. In the years that followed, Litorius continued to rely on Hun support in his struggle with the Visigoths. Roman victories in 437 and 438 bore the imprint of their cavalry, even if not always acknowledged. Aetius himself struck down thousands of Goths in 438, though the composition of his army goes unrecorded. The conflict reached its height in 439 when Litorius led the Huns to besiege Toulouse itself, capital of the Visigothic kingdom. The Goths, weary from repeated defeats, sent bishops to negotiate, but Litorius spurned them, preferring to trust in his pagan allies. He even revived the ancient Roman rituals, offering sacrifices and consulting soothsayers before the battle, the last time such ceremonies were performed by a Roman general. At first, the Huns inflicted terrible losses, but when Litorius was captured during the fighting, the tide turned. The Hun army was cut down almost entirely. Taken prisoner, Litorius was executed at Toulouse, a grim reminder of the biblical warning that he who exalts himself will be humbled. Only after months of exhaustion did Aetius himself arrive, managing to fight the Visigoths to a draw. Peace was eventually brokered by Aetius, who had now played a role on both the battlefield and the diplomatic stage, while Aetius returned to Italy to confront even greater challenges. When Litorius's Huns passed Aetius's estate on their way to Narbonne, they were fresh from a clash with yet another of Aetius's foes. This third enemy was more significant than either the Burgundians or the Visigoths: the Bagaudae, the rebel peasants, slaves, and brigands of northwestern Gaul. The sources tell us little, but a Gallic chronicle records that in 435, the Bagaudae of the Armorican region declared complete independence from the empire. The Tractus Armoricanus was a vast territory, extending from the Garonne to the Seine, encompassing Poitou, Brittany, Anjou, and Normandy, with major cities such as Tours, Orléans, and Auxerre. In this great expanse, oppressed rural populations rose against their Roman and Gallic overlords. The Bagaudae were not new. A century earlier, their forebears had produced their own emperors, Aelianus and Amandus, and their breakaway regime seems to have imitated the very structure of the empire it defied. To dismiss it as a mere robber state is unfair, for it more closely represented a desperate effort by the downtrodden to free themselves from Roman exploitation. In the wider sweep of imperial history, such open secession was rare, rivaled only by the earlier Gallic independence movements that supported Postumus and Tetricus during the 3rd century. In 435, the rebellion of the Bagaudae was led by a man named Tibato, a figure otherwise unknown, even his name being unique in the records. What is certain is that soon after he rose, almost every slave in Gaul rallied to his cause. For 2 years, Tibato's forces held their ground, but in 437, Litorius and his Hunnic allies fell upon them. The details of the struggle are lost to us, but a chronicle notes that Tibato was captured. Some of his fellow leaders were chained, others executed, and the revolt collapsed. Litorius, as one historian later remarked, was forced to reimpose upon them the liberty of imperial rule. A court poet celebrated the suppression in lofty terms, claiming that the wild lands of Armorica had been tamed, its fields sown with grain rather than crime, and its people once again upholding Roman law. Yet the victory was hollow. Litorius rode on with confidence toward Narbonne, but his path would end at Toulouse. One campaign was never enough to quell the Bagaudae of Armorica. Their rebellion was rooted in the deeper economic decay of the empire, which could not be solved by the slaughter of peasants. Nor would the Huns remain forever the blunt instrument of the Gallic landowning class. From Aetius's treaty with Rua in 433, until Litorius's disastrous defeat before Toulouse in 439, the Huns were the chief support of the faltering Gallo-Roman aristocracy. But their massacre outside Toulouse marked the breaking point. Oppression carried out solely in the service of great landlords was bound to fail. After that disaster, the Huns did not return to reinforce Aetius in Gaul, for their forces were needed elsewhere. Events soon shifted back to the Danube frontier. At the start of 434, Rua's principal envoy, Attila, appeared in Constantinople with a stark demand. The Eastern Romans must return to him certain peoples who had fled his authority, or he would declare war. Rua had chosen his moment carefully. The Huns struck only when Roman strength was divided. 395 when the armies were in Italy, 422 when they were fighting Persia. And once again, in 434, the East was weak. Large parts of Africa had recently fallen to the Vandals, a loss that men in Constantinople compared to Athens' disastrous Sicilian expedition. Troops had been dispatched to support the West, but in 432 Boniface's return to Italy left Aspar and the Eastern forces alone in Africa. And though he was appointed Western consul in 434, the province was essentially lost. It was the perfect moment for Rua to press his claim. The fugitives in question were the Amilzuri, Itimari, Tunsures, Boishi, and others unnamed by the sources. They lived near the Danube, but little else is known of them. It seems most likely that they were Hunnic tribes who resisted Rua's supremacy, preferring to retain their old independence under chiefs of their own, while serving Rome as auxiliaries. This shows clearly that the Huns were still far from unified under one political authority. The Eastern government, always eager for new soldiers, and especially desperate while its armies were tied down in Africa, prepared to negotiate. Two powerful figures stepped forward. Plintha, a Goth who had once crushed a revolt in Palestine and risen to become consul and later master of the soldiers, was deeply influential at the court of Theodosius, despite his Arian faith. Alongside him was Dionysius, a former consul and commander of the Eastern armies. Together they volunteered to approach Rua. Plintha even dispatched an agent, Sengalacus, to persuade Rua to negotiate directly with him and no one else. It appears that a Gothic circle at court was trying to monopolize these dealings, though it remains uncertain exactly whom they sought to exclude. Here we catch a rare glimpse of the political rivalries within Theodosius' court, though our evidence is too fragmentary to draw firm conclusions. In the end, no embassy was needed. Before the campaigning season of 434 could begin, Rua suddenly died. His death was a great relief in Constantinople, where his threats had stirred real alarm. The Patriarch Proclus marked the news with a sermon of thanksgiving, invoking the words of Ezekiel. "Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will punish him with pestilence and blood, with torrents of rain, hailstones, fire, and brimstone, upon him and his many hosts." To the Romans, Rua's passing seemed nothing less than divine deliverance. The sermon delivered by the Patriarch Proclus after Rua's death quickly became the talk of Constantinople. He had used the words of Ezekiel with great effect, and soon stories began to spread that blurred the sequence of events. People claimed that before the expected attack, Proclus had declared that God would strike Rua down with a thunderbolt and destroy his people with fire and brimstone. Others insisted the prophecy had been fulfilled, since Rua had never come close to the capital. In time, the tale grew into a miracle, reported by Greek and Ethiopian writers alike, who said that when Rua prepared to attack the Eastern Empire, he and his army were wiped out by divine judgment. No miracle, however, prevented what followed. Rua's place was taken by his two nephews, Bleda, the elder, and the younger, Attila. The sources tell little about Bleda beyond his coarse and boisterous nature, which contrasted sharply with his brothers. After the campaign of 441, he kept at his side a Moorish dwarf named Zerko, whose stammering voice and twisted gait amused him endlessly. He dressed the dwarf in miniature armor and paraded him at feasts and on campaigns. When Zerko once escaped with Roman prisoners, Bleda cared nothing for the others but raged at the loss of his favorite, sending horsemen to scour the land until he was recaptured. When asked why he had fled, Zerko answered in his broken speech that he had never been given a wife. Bleda laughed uproariously and swore that he would marry him to one of the ladies from the empress's court in Constantinople. Attila could not have been more different. Later, when Roman envoys visited his camp, they described him as stern and unyielding, yet not without a sense of justice. The historian Priscus saw him more than once, and the portrait he left was later repeated by Jordanes and made famous by Gibbon. Yet the early years after he and Bleda assumed power are obscure. We know only the terms of their first treaty with the Eastern Romans, after which several years vanish into silence. The Senate resolved to send an embassy even after Rua's death. Plintha, an experienced Gothic general at the Roman court, was chosen to lead it, accompanied by Epigenes, a noted orator who had worked on the Theodosian Code. They traveled to Margus in Moesia Superior, a city near the mouth of the Morava River and an important trading hub. Outside its walls, Bleda and Attila met them, conducting the talks from horseback. The Romans, unwilling to stand beneath the mounted Huns, sat awkwardly in their saddles throughout the negotiations. An agreement was struck. The Romans were to return all fugitives from Hunnic lands and hand back Roman prisoners who had escaped, or else pay a ransom of 8 solidi for each, enough to buy nearly 100 bushels of grain in ordinary times. They pledged not to ally with any enemies of the Huns, and Hunnic merchants were to enjoy full and equal trading rights within the empire. The East had already been paying Rua an annual tribute of 350 pounds of gold, likely imposed when Roman troops had been drawn away to Africa in 431. Attila demanded more. The tribute was doubled, and henceforth 700 pounds of gold would be sent across the Danube each year. This agreement became known as the Peace of Margus, concluded in 435. What Attila did in the years immediately afterward remains uncertain. Priscus offers only one hint, noting that after the treaty the brothers campaigned in Scythia and fought against a people called the Soroski, otherwise unknown. It seems likely that during this time, Attila pushed his dominion to its final limits. The exact boundaries cannot be determined. To the west, the Huns never reached the Rhine, where the Burgundians and the Ripuarian Franks remained independent. Oktar, Rua's brother, had earlier tried to advance that far, but died before completing the task. To the north, Priscus recorded that Attila ruled the islands in the ocean. Later, historians understood this to mean the Baltic Islands, though Priscus may have thought it referred to Britain, given his limited knowledge of northwestern geography. Whatever the case, it is likely that Attila's influence extended into the northern lands, drawing tribute in the form of furs. Priscus claimed that Attila ruled all Scythia, but how far his authority stretched to the east is uncertain. Some later scholars suggested that the Alans living between the Don and the lands west of the Aral Sea also acknowledged his power. Yet it is unlikely they did so without reservation. The Alans had never truly secured independence, but they seem to have been ruled by Huns, who did not always answer directly to Attila. Other tribes, such as the Akadziri east of the Black Sea, maintained their own chiefs until well into the late 400s and 40s, and it is improbable that they were unique in this independence. What can be said with more confidence is that all the Germanic and other peoples living between the Alps and the Baltic, and from the Caspian to some uncertain point east of the Rhine, recognized the authority of Attila and his elder brother Bleda. The brothers ruled jointly, but divided the empire into separate regions, though it is unknown which controlled which portion. From 435 to 440, the Eastern Empire experienced a fragile peace along the Danube frontier. In the west, Attila continued the policy of his uncle Rua, whose cavalry had supported the Roman general Aetius. These forces remained active in Gaul until they were destroyed outside Toulouse in 439. After that disaster, however, they were not replaced, for pressure on the Danube was mounting. The treaty negotiated in 435 had bound Constantinople to return fugitives and pay an annual tribute of 700 pounds of gold. The Romans handed back some captives at once, including 2 young princes named Mama and Atacam, who were crucified upon their return. Yet over the next few years, the payments seemed to have lapsed, and the fugitives were far too useful as soldiers to be surrendered. Theodosius must have known the risk he was running. In 439, he ordered the prefect Cyrus to complete the sea walls of Constantinople, sealing the gaps that had been left when the great land walls were built earlier in the century. The reason was clear. A hostile fleet, especially if linked to the Huns, could strike the capital at its weakest points. Internal unrest also added to the danger. A Rugian chieftain named Vallips rebelled, rallied malcontents in the provinces, and seized Noviodunum on the Danube before forcing concessions from the government. Yet, despite such troubles, the frontier remained well guarded, the fortresses manned, and the warships of Anthemius still patrolling the river. Attila, occupied with campaigns in the north, had no way to enforce his claim to the tribute that never arrived. It seemed the opportunities enjoyed in earlier decades by Hun leaders would not return. Then, in 439 to 440, circumstances shifted dramatically. The fall of Carthage to the Vandals shook the empire to its core. The loss of North Africa endangered not only Rome, but Constantinople, for Carthage could serve as a base for raiders who might disrupt the grain supply from Egypt, or even strike at the eastern provinces directly. To prevent disaster, Theodosius sent a vast naval expedition, over 1,000 ships under Germanic commanders, to attempt the recovery of the province. This effort was not reckless, but a recognition that the fate of both East and West now hinged on Africa. At nearly the same moment, the Persians launched an invasion of Armenia. Although they soon withdrew under threat from northern nomads, the Romans had to commit troops to face the danger. The result was that the Danube frontier was left dangerously exposed. Attila recognized his chance and seized it. The first warning came when a trading post north of the river, where the Huns had long enjoyed market rights, was suddenly captured. The raid took place during market day, and the Roman garrison was overwhelmed. The government protested, citing the Treaty of 435 that guaranteed safe commerce, but the Huns replied with heavier accusations. They charged that the Bishop of Margus had crossed the Danube, plundered royal tombs, and stolen the treasures buried with Hun leaders. The ambassadors could not convincingly deny the charge. They were also accused of sheltering fugitives from Hun authority in violation of the treaty. another point the Huns could easily prove. When their demands for the bishop and the fugitives were rejected, Attila's forces crossed the Danube and swept into the provinces. Town after town fell, and the great fortress city of Viminacium was utterly destroyed. Archaeological finds confirm the catastrophe. Coins from the buried city treasury remain as silent evidence of the hasty preparations of its magistrates. Those who survived the slaughter were led away into captivity, and the once thriving city lay in ruins for a century until rebuilt by Justinian. The fall of Viminacium sent a wave of fear through the frontier towns. Many began to demand that the Bishop of Margus be handed over to the Huns, asking why entire provinces should be endangered for the sake of one man. Realizing that he might indeed be sacrificed, the bishop chose to act first. He slipped out of Margus, deserted to the enemy, and promised Attila that he would deliver the city into his hands. A Hun detachment was posted nearby during the night. The gates were opened from within, and Margus was betrayed. Like Viminacium, it was destroyed, but unlike that city, it was never rebuilt, and its bishop vanished from history. At the same time, the fortress of Constantia across the river fell, and soon after, the Huns captured Singidunum, leaving it desolate until it was restored a century later. The gravest loss of all was the destruction of Sirmium, the most critical stronghold on the Danube frontier. Its fall broke the defensive system of the river and opened the Balkans to attack. The campaign of 441 ended there. Although the Huns had not penetrated deeply into Roman territory, their victories tore a huge gap in the defensive barrier and left the provinces exposed for the following year. Surprisingly, there was no fighting in 442. Somehow, Aspar, commander of the Eastern armies, arranged a truce that lasted through the season. Theodosius and his ministers used the time urgently. The fleet recalled from Sicily, which had accomplished nothing against the Vandals, returned too late to aid the frontier, but was now available for further war. To prepare for renewed struggle, the emperor issued a special coinage of gold solidi. The coins were hurriedly struck, showing Theodosius in military attire on the front and a helmeted figure of Constantinople on the back. Unlike earlier issues that boasted of Roman glory, these coins carried only the date, a sign of how desperate the situation had become. Even members of the imperial family, including the Empress and Pulcheria, contributed their valuables to support the new issue. When the campaign of 443 began, Attila demanded the return of fugitives and the unpaid tribute, threatening to unleash his forces if refused. The government rejected his demands, but sent envoys in hopes of negotiating. The Huns responded with war. They struck first at Ratiaria, a major base of the Danube fleet and home to an imperial arms factory. The city was utterly destroyed, its people enslaved, and the frontier left unguarded. With their rear secured, Attila's forces advanced inland. They marched up the Morava Valley and stormed Naissus, the birthplace of Constantine and one of the great strongholds of the Balkans. The city was ravaged and left abandoned for generations. From there, the Huns pressed on to Sardica, reducing another major center to ruins, and then swept down the highway along the Hebrus Valley. Philippopolis fell, leaving the Balkan defenses in collapse. Adrianople and Heraclea managed to resist, but Arcadiopolis was captured, adding to the immense spoils and countless prisoners. Theodosius finally assembled an army under Aspar, Ariobindus, and Arnagisclus, but the Romans were repeatedly defeated in a series of battles near the capital. The Huns cut them off from Constantinople, drove them back into the Chersonesus, and reached the sea both north and south of the city. Even Atharas, dangerously close to the walls of the capital, was occupied. Yet Constantinople itself was safe. The newly completed fortifications were too formidable to be assaulted. Instead, Attila turned his attention to the Roman field army, which he crushed in the Chersonesus. With that, organized resistance in the Balkans collapsed. The empire managed only one real success during the campaign, and it was not achieved by the regular army. A detachment of Huns, commanded by some of their most capable leaders, broke away from the main host and invaded Lower Moesia. Laden with plunder and captives, they eventually drew near the small but well-fortified town of Asimus, which stood on the Danube between Uscus and Ad Novas at the mouth of the Osma River. The townspeople, unwilling to rely solely on their walls, chose to defend themselves actively. Informed by spies of the Huns' movements and recognizing how burdened the raiders had become, the men of Asimus struck suddenly. Though heavily outnumbered, they inflicted serious losses on the enemy, freed many captives, and returned to their city almost unscathed. This victory, however, was an isolated one. After the crushing defeats suffered in the Chersonesus, the Eastern Emperor had no choice but to sue for peace. Negotiations were entrusted to Anatolius, a commander who had earlier concluded the war with Persia and who held the rank of Master of Soldiers in the East. Attila, satisfied that he had already gained what he wanted, imposed harsh terms. All fugitives from his dominions were to be surrendered without delay. The arrears of tribute were calculated at 6,000 pounds of gold, to be paid immediately. Moreover, the annual tribute agreed upon in 435 was now tripled. Henceforth, Attila would receive 2,100 pounds of gold each year. The ransom for Roman prisoners who escaped the Huns was raised from 8 to 12 solidi per head, and the empire was strictly forbidden to shelter fugitives from Hunnic rule in the future. This agreement was concluded by late August 443, in time for Theodosius to return from Asia Minor to Constantinople. Once the terms were settled, one of Attila's senior commanders, Scotta, arrived in Constantinople to collect the tribute and the fugitives. The gold was handed over, but the fugitives were not. Those unwilling to return had been massacred by the Romans, and among them were even some of Attila's relatives who had refused to submit to his authority. Scotta did not protest, but announced that another condition had been added to the treaty. The people of Asimus, who had humiliated the Huns, must be surrendered together with any prisoners they had taken. If not, the Hun army would remain in Roman territory, and the treaty would be void. Anatolius, assisted by Theodulus, the commander in Thrace, saw that refusal meant renewed war. They appealed to Scotta to withdraw his demand, but Attila's readiness to resume hostilities was unmistakable. Instead, they wrote to the citizens of Asimus, ordering them either to hand over the Roman prisoners they had freed or to pay 12 solidi for each one, in line with the new ransom rate. They were also told to release any Huns they had captured. The townsmen replied that the rescued Romans had long since dispersed to their homes and could not be brought back, and that they had already killed the Hun captives, sparing only 2 in hopes of exchanging them for local children taken outside the city walls. Attila's men searched for the missing children, but found no trace of them. Accepting this explanation, the Huns demanded only the return of the 2 surviving prisoners, which the townsfolk handed over. With that, the first Peace of Anatolius was ratified in the autumn of 443. Peace after the Treaty of 443 proved deceptive. Attila soon dispatched another embassy to Constantinople, raising questions about the return of fugitives. One embassy was followed by another, until the 4th appeared at the capital. On each occasion, Theodosius' ministers received the envoys with costly gifts, as custom required, while firmly declaring that no fugitives remained on Roman soil. This was likely true, but Attila's real aim was clear. The embassies gave his followers an opportunity to enrich themselves with lavish offerings from the imperial court. New grievances and minor complaints were manufactured endlessly, providing his lieutenants with steady streams of wealth. At the same time, the eastern frontiers of the empire were under strain everywhere. Although the Persians had withdrawn from Armenia in 442, their armies remained massed along the border, and since Anatolius had secured only a single year's truce, new hostilities were expected. Frontier defenses were further weakened by local landowners who had seized imperial estates, diverting men who once garrisoned the border into agricultural labor. To the west of Armenia lived the Tsani, whose barren lands drove them to constant raiding of Roman territory near Trapezus. In Asia Minor, the Isaurians poured from their mountains to plunder the countryside. Saracen tribes menaced provinces on the desert frontier, and even the kingdom of Axum in Ethiopia appeared troublesome. None of these threats alone endangered the empire, but each demanded troops, spreading the army thin. So, while Attila's ambassadors swarmed to Constantinople in 444, Roman forces were scattered across the provinces, leaving the government in no position to confront the Huns with firmness. Despite these pressures, Theodosius sought to strengthen his northern frontier. In September 443, barely a month after the end of fighting, he ordered Nomus, one of his most trusted ministers, to restore the defenses along the Danube, where Attila had first broken through in 441. The fortresses were to be repaired, and their garrisons restored to full strength. By 444, these tasks were evidently carried out to the emperor's satisfaction, for Nomus was rewarded with the consulship the following year. Yet, while these works progressed, the government could do little but receive Attila's envoys, load them with gifts, and answer each fresh demand as best it could. The plans of the Huns during these years remain obscure, as much of Priscus' record is lost. But one event is certain. Bleda was murdered by his younger brother. The exact date is uncertain, but all evidence points to 445. The reasons for their quarrel are unknown, yet the result was decisive. Bleda's followers and territories now came under Attila's direct control, leaving him without a rival for the rest of his life. To consolidate his authority, Attila turned to superstition. Around this time, a herdsman discovered an ancient sword buried in the grass, revealed by the blood of an injured animal. Attila proclaimed it the sword of the war god, a weapon once revered by earlier leaders of the Huns, and now restored to him. It was a divine sign, he declared, proof that his rule was sanctioned by heaven. Those who challenged his authority would face not only his power, but the will of the gods themselves. In these years, the Huns remained outwardly at peace, and life in their camps seemed remarkably different from the restless turmoil of the empire. One Roman captive later recalled their peacetime existence as carefree, with each man content with his lot and free from the troubles that plagued Roman society. A fragment of Priscus preserves a glimpse of Rome's diplomacy at this time. Theodosius sent Senator, a former consul and close advisor, as ambassador to Attila. Senator, however, dreaded the long overland journey and instead sailed across the Black Sea to Odessus, where he met Theodolus, then serving as commander in Thrace. From there, he continued north, most likely bound for a Hunnic encampment near the northern or northwestern shores of the Black Sea. This suggests that during these years, Attila had withdrawn into the heart of his domains, consolidating his power after eliminating his brother. The Huns struck the Eastern Roman Empire again in 447, their second great invasion. No source explains the pretext, but the underlying reason is clear enough. Under Attila, constant plunder was a necessity for their society. One thing, however, is certain. The peace was not broken through any fault of the Roman government. Had it been otherwise, Priscus, who was never slow to criticize, would surely have made the point at length. The truth is that the empire had suffered enough without provoking an attack. The winter following the Peace of Anatolius was one of unusual severity. Snow remained on the ground for half a year, and thousands of people and animals perished from the cold. The following year brought violent storms to Bithynia, destroying whole towns and farms. In 445, riots in the Circus of Constantinople left many dead, followed by a plague that carried off more of the population. Shortages of food and another outbreak of disease marked the next year. Theodosius's ministers were in no condition to gamble with the northern frontier. Attila chose this moment, at the height of his power, to launch his new campaign in the spring of 447. Contemporary observers described it as greater than his earlier assault, and he did not march alone. The Gepids under their king Ardaric, the Goths under Valamir, and other subject peoples joined the Hun squadrons. The invasion swept through Lower Scythia and Moesia, bypassing the new defenses recently raised by Nomus. For once, Attila faced the full strength of the Eastern Roman field armies, since no other fronts distracted them at that moment. But nature struck a crippling blow before the armies even clashed. A massive series of earthquakes began on January 26th and lasted 4 months, said by witnesses to be the worst in memory. Villages were destroyed, the sea rose against the land, and Constantinople itself suffered grievously. 57 towers of the Theodosian walls crumbled, leaving gaping breaches. Panic swept the capital, compounded by a fresh outbreak of plague among those trapped in the ruins. Yet the city rallied. Under the leadership of the circus factions, and directed by the Praetorian prefect Flavius Constantinus, the walls were repaired in just 60 days, and a new outer wall was added. Constantinople now stood behind 3 lines of defense, over 100 feet high and nearly 200 feet thick. Inscriptions still preserved celebrate the feat, though the poetry hardly matches the achievement. The defense of the capital was placed in the hands of Flavius Zeno, an Isaurian commanding a large force of his own people. Why men traditionally hostile to the empire were entrusted with such a role remains unclear, but their appointment did little to reassure the plague-stricken citizens. Many fled as the Huns drew near, though claims that Theodosius himself prepared to run are likely exaggerated. The emperor was not entirely unready. The decisive clash came near the river Utus in Dacia Ripensis. Attila's forces met the imperial army advancing from Marcianople under the command of Arnagisclus, a German officer notorious for the murder of the Vandal John, but now master of the soldiers in Thrace. He resisted more stubbornly than any Roman commander had yet managed. In a desperate battle he fought with great courage, losing his horse but continuing the struggle until he himself fell. Attila won the day, but at heavy cost. Some suspect that this battle inflicted wounds from which the Huns never fully recovered. It was, in fact, Attila's last clear victory over Roman arms. Marcianople, the general's base and the largest city of Thrace, was left defenseless and was destroyed, lying in ruins until rebuilt a century later. The Huns did not attempt Constantinople itself, for the newly restored walls were unassailable. Instead, They ravaged the Balkan provinces with shocking ferocity. Thrace, Illyricum, both provinces of Dacia, Moesia, and Scythia, all suffered devastation. Then, turning south, they pressed into Greece, pushing as far as Thermopylae before being halted. The details of this invasion remain even more obscure than those of 441, but the scale of destruction is beyond doubt. A contemporary account by Callinicus in the life of Saint Hypatius paints the horror. More than 100 cities were said to have fallen. Churches and monasteries were sacked. Monks and maidens were slain, and the land was drenched in blood. Others put the figure nearer 70 towns, but the devastation was still enormous. A Gallic chronicler observed bitterly that while the east lay in ruins, the west sent no aid, suggesting that some in Rome believed Aetius had abandoned Constantinople in its hour of need. Later, Count Marcellinus summed up the campaign with grim force. Attila, he said, had ground almost the whole of Europe into the dust. The 3 years after the devastating invasion of 447 were marked not by fresh battles, but by diplomacy. The Romans, drained of military strength, could rely only on their envoys. Yet through persistence and tact, they gained more than might have been expected. Unlike the obscurity surrounding the war itself, the diplomacy of these years is unusually well documented. This is because Priscus, who personally served on the main embassy of 449, devoted a lengthy and detailed account to what he witnessed. Before turning to his narrative, however, it is necessary to describe one more campaign of Attila in Eastern Europe, the last he would wage there. A people known as the Akatziri became his targets. Priscus considered them to be a branch of the Huns, and there is no reason to doubt this. Their homeland is difficult to pinpoint precisely. One account placed them far north, near the mouth of the Vistula, bordered by the Aesti to the east, and settled further south by other tribes. Yet Priscus's description suggests a location much closer to the Black Sea, perhaps near the Sea of Azov. Later evidence indicates that when new peoples pressed into Europe, the Akatziri were the first to feel their attacks, suggesting they lived in a region not far from the approaches to Persia. Some scholars believe their name is of Old Turkish origin, meaning forest people, though the exact interpretation is debated. They were remembered for their strength and courage. They had no knowledge of farming, but lived as pastoral nomads, sustaining themselves on their herds and by hunting. Their society was organized by clans and tribes, each under its own chief. In material culture, they belonged to the simpler level of pastoral life, much like the Huns themselves before their great conquests. How they had survived the rapid expansion of Attila and Bleda earlier in the century without being subdued remains unclear, though it may be that the Huns had not yet pressed so far east. For a time, the Akatziri remained on friendly terms with the Huns. Their position, however, gave them considerable strategic importance. As an independent power at the rear of Attila's dominions, they could be useful to Constantinople, and the Eastern Roman government followed a long-standing policy of encouraging such peoples as counterweights to hostile tribes across the frontier. Theodosius therefore sent gifts to their leaders in an effort to draw them into alliance with the empire. Unfortunately, the envoy he dispatched failed to recognize the subtleties of Akatzirian society. Among the chiefs was Coriticus, who ranked above the others. Protocol required that he be given precedence, but instead, he received his gifts second. Feeling insulted, Coriticus turned to Attila and urged him to punish the rival chiefs who had been favored over him. Attila seized the opportunity. His forces marched swiftly and, after a series of clashes, subdued the Akatziri. He then summoned Kyriakos to appear before him. But the chief, wary of his benefactor's motives, replied with a carefully veiled refusal. "It was difficult for a man to look upon a god," he said. "If the sun itself could not be stared at directly, how could one gaze safely upon the greatest of gods?" His caution saved him. Attila allowed him to remain ruler of his own tribe, but placed the rest of the Akatsiri under the authority of his eldest son, Elak. Thus Theodosius' hopes of gaining a valuable ally behind Attila's lines collapsed, and no further attempt was made to win influence among the peoples of the Pontic steppes. In 448, peace was re-established along the northern frontier, though the precise negotiations that secured it remain obscure. What is clear is that the same Anatolius who had concluded the settlement of 443 once again served as Rome's chief envoy. The terms, however, were harsher than before. Attila demanded that the Romans evacuate a vast strip of territory south of the Danube, stretching from Singidunum to Nove, a distance of some 300 miles, and extending 5 days' journey deep into Roman lands, roughly 100 miles or more. This meant abandoning all of Dacia Ripensis and large parts of 3 neighboring provinces, shifting the frontier line as far back as Naissus. The Danube, once the great fortified barrier of the Eastern Empire, ceased to be its effective border. Tribute payments were also to continue, though the precise amount is uncertain. For the next 2 years, Roman diplomacy revolved around attempts to soften these conditions. In the spring of 449, one of Attila's most influential lieutenants, Adeco, arrived in Constantinople. He had been present during the negotiations of the previous year and now returned accompanied by another of Attila's trusted men, Orestes. Though serving the Huns, Orestes was himself Roman by birth, a native of Pannonia, and later father of the boy who would become the last Western emperor. Adeco brought a letter from Attila, delivered in the palace and translated by Bigelas, the imperial interpreter who had long dealt with the Huns. Attila's message accused the Romans of failing to surrender all fugitives and of not evacuating the Danubian lands as agreed. If these obligations were not met at once, he threatened to resume the war. He also demanded that Rome send high-ranking ambassadors, former consuls of the empire, to settle remaining disputes, promising that if they came, he would ride as far as Sardica to meet them. It was, in essence, another attempt to extract concessions through intimidation, much as he had done after the earlier peace of 443. This time, however, the Roman government resolved upon a desperate stratagem: to rid themselves of Attila by assassination. After Adeco's formal audience in the palace, he was taken to meet the emperor's most powerful minister, the eunuch Chrysaphius. For several years, Chrysaphius had dominated the court of Theodosius, controlling policy and wealth alike. Though accused by his enemies of greed, he was above all a shrewd manipulator of power. Now he turned his talents to eliminating Attila. Adeco was dazzled by the grandeur of the imperial palaces, and Chrysaphius, through Bigelas, suggested that he too might enjoy such riches if he abandoned his allegiance to the Huns. Adeco protested that he could not betray his master without permission, but when Chrysaphius pressed further, asking if he had access to Attila and any authority among the Huns, Adeco admitted that as one of the chosen guards, it was his duty to protect the ruler personally for part of each day. Chrysaphius then swore an oath of secrecy and revealed his plan. If Adeco returned north, killed Attila, and escaped back to Constantinople, he would live in luxury and wealth for the rest of his life. Adeco agreed, but said he would need 50 pounds of gold to secure the loyalty of those under his command. Chrysaphius was ready to provide it immediately. but Edeco objected. Attila, he explained, always examined carefully what gifts and payments his envoys received, and such a sum could never be concealed. Instead, he proposed that he return home as though nothing unusual had happened, while Bigilus accompanied him on a mission concerning the fugitives. Bigilus would then instruct him on how to receive the gold discreetly. Chrysaphius accepted this alteration. The minister rushed to inform Theodosius, who called in Martialis, the master of the offices, to refine the plan. They decided to add another layer of deception. Along with Bigilus, they would dispatch Maximinus, a respected nobleman, on a formal embassy to Attila. Maximinus would be kept ignorant of the plot, his sole task being to deliver the emperor's reply to Attila's letter. This reply stated that Bigilus was merely an interpreter, while Maximinus was a man of high rank and close to the emperor. It further declared that Rome had no reason to provoke Attila, since all fugitives had been returned, including the last 17 recently in imperial custody. Orally, Maximinus was to add that Attila should not insist on envoys of consular rank, for neither he nor other rulers of the steppe had previously dealt with such dignitaries. This, however, was a deliberate falsehood, since men of the highest status, like Anatolius and Senator, had indeed served as ambassadors before. Theodosius's reluctance to send another such figure stemmed from fear. If the plot were discovered, no eminent Roman would ever leave Attila's camp alive. Thus, under these perilous circumstances, Maximinus set out as Rome's official envoy, while Bigilus carried the darker mission that could alter the balance of power in Europe. In the early summer of 449, a Roman embassy rode out from Constantinople, led by Maximinus. He was a man of standing, though not of the very highest rank, and had first appeared in public life as a commissioner for the Theodosian Code. Within a few years, he had advanced to greater responsibilities, and by this time was considered a reliable, if not especially brilliant, official. It was likely for this reason that the emperor and his advisors entrusted him with the dangerous task of negotiating with Attila, accompanied by the interpreter Bigilus. Fortune has preserved his story, for Maximinus asked his friend Priscus, who would later become our main authority on these events, to join him as a companion on the journey. Priscus himself had not yet entered history before this point. He may have been attached to one of the imperial offices under the master of the offices, which might explain how Maximinus came to know him. On this embassy, he served not as a formal official, but as a close advisor, in the tradition of attaching philosophers or sophists to embassies to provide eloquence and counsel. Rusticius also joined the party, seeking to settle personal business with one of Attila's secretaries. A native of Moesia, who had long lived among the Huns as a captive, Rusticius was one of the few Romans fluent in their tongue and proved invaluable to the mission. The group also included Edeco, the Hun commander secretly entangled in a plot to kill Attila, Orestes, the Roman-born secretary in Hun service, several lesser Huns, attendants, and drivers for the pack animals that carried food and diplomatic gifts. Roman ambassadors traveled provisioned by their own state, rather than relying on the lands they passed through, so they rode heavily laden. After 13 days, they reached Sardica, a city still lying in ruins since the Hun invasion of 441. There, Maximinus prepared a dinner for Edeco and the senior Huns of the party, purchasing livestock from the few inhabitants who still lingered among the wreckage. The meal passed uneasily. When the Huns toasted Attila, Maximinus raised the name of Theodosius in return, but Bigilus, clumsy as ever, remarked that it was improper to mention a god, that is, the emperor, in the same breath as a mere man. The Huns took offense, and the Roman hosts were forced to change the subject and pour more wine to soothe tempers. Maximinus later tried to smooth relations further by presenting Edeco and Orestes with costly pearls and fine silk. Yet an odd exchange followed. After Edeco departed, Orestes lingered and remarked cryptically that Maximinus had avoided the error of Roman officials who once dined only with Edeco, and gave him exclusive gifts. The ambassador, puzzled, asked what he meant, but Orestes withdrew without explanation. The next morning, still troubled, Maximinus and Priscus discussed the matter with Bigellus. The interpreter brushed it off, saying Orestes had no right to feel slighted. He was only a secretary, while Edeco was a Hun warrior of high rank. Then, with breathtaking indiscretion, Bigellus went straight to Edeco and repeated Orestes' words. He returned saying that he had barely calmed Edeco's anger. What Bigellus failed to see was that Orestes had likely guessed the existence of a plot, and that Edeco, already betraying the conspiracy, had seized the chance to inform his companions. In truth, Attila already knew of the plan against him, the sum of gold promised to Edeco, and even the content of the emperor's letter carried by Maximinus. The embassy pressed on to Nisus, where the devastation of nomadic war was plain to see. Once adorned by Constantine, the city now lay in ruins. Buildings lay collapsed. The streets were deserted save for a few sick souls lingering in church hostels, and bones of the slain covered the riverbank. 6 years after its fall, no attempt at rebuilding had been made. The ambassadors set their camp upstream, away from the grisly remains. Soon after, they encountered Aegynthius, commander of Roman forces in Illyricum, and instructed him to surrender 5 of the 17 fugitives Attila had demanded. Aegynthius handed them over with words of comfort, and the embassy continued deeper into the world of the Huns. The next stage of the embassy's journey brought them to the Danube, where they were ferried across in rough boats carved from single tree trunks. They traveled with groups of Huns preparing for Attila's arrival, for the king planned to cross the river and hunt in newly secured territories south of the frontier. After passing some 70 stades beyond the river, the Romans were ordered to halt while Edeco's companions rode ahead to announce their presence. That evening, as the Romans sat down to their meal, the sound of galloping horses broke the stillness, and 2 Huns appeared, summoning them to prepare for an audience with their master. The newcomers accepted food from the Romans and joined their supper, then guided them the following day toward Attila's encampment. From a hilltop, the ambassadors looked down upon a vast sea of tents spread across the plain. But when they attempted to camp where they stood, their escorts rebuked them. They could not pitch their tents above Attila's. Forced to descend to the plain, they were confronted by Edeco, Orestes, Scotta, and other lieutenants of the Hun leader. These men brusquely demanded to know the purpose of the Roman mission. The bluntness of the question stunned the Romans into silence. The Huns repeated it with growing anger until Maximinus firmly replied that he had been ordered to address Attila alone. Scotta retorted that the question had come directly from Attila, otherwise they would never have bothered to meet them. Maximinus stood his ground, declaring that no envoy could reveal his message before reaching the ruler to whom he was sent, and reminded them that Huns themselves, in their visits to Constantinople, knew these diplomatic conventions well. His insistence left the Huns no choice but to withdraw. Yet, when they returned a short while later, Edeco was noticeably absent, and to Maximinus's amazement, they recited word for word the contents of the emperor's letter and the instructions he carried. They ended by ordering the Romans to leave the frontier at once, unless they had something more to add. Perplexed at how their secrets had been betrayed, Maximinus nevertheless refused to speak to anyone but Attila and demanded fair treatment. The Huns dismissed him curtly. The Romans prepared to depart in gloom. Bigulaus turned on Maximinus, scolding him for refusing to improvise. A lie, he insisted, would have been better than returning home empty-handed. He even claimed that, had he been allowed to address Attila personally, he could have resolved the dispute at once, boasting of the friendship he had once enjoyed during earlier embassies. He had not yet realized that it was Edeco who had betrayed the plot. With nightfall approaching, Maximinus ordered the packs strapped to the horses, but before they could depart, another group of Huns arrived bearing gifts of ox meat and fish, said to be from Attila himself, and invited them to remain until morning. Their hopes for better treatment were short-lived, for the next day the same men returned with the same ultimatum. Unless they had something more to say, they must go. Maximinus, sunk in dejection, remained silent, while Bigulaus again urged him to pretend he had further instructions. Seeing his friend disheartened, Priscus resolved to act. With Rusticius to interpret, he approached Scotta privately, offering rich gifts from Maximinus's stores in exchange for arranging an interview with Attila. To flatter and provoke him at once, he said that he had heard Scotta held great influence, but would only believe it when he saw it in action. Scotta, offended, declared that none in the camp wielded more authority than he, and spurred away in anger to prove it. Soon after, Maximinus, encouraged by Priscus's initiative, called back his departing servants. Scotta returned and summoned them to Attila's tent. Guards thronged around the king's dwelling, but the Romans were admitted without delay. Inside, Attila sat on a wooden chair, his squat frame and broad face leaving a powerful impression on Priscus. The deep-set eyes, flat nose, and sparse beard gave him an appearance both harsh and forbidding. Maximinus advanced, presented the emperor's letter, and declared that Theodosius prayed for the well-being of the Hun ruler and his people. Attila answered darkly that the Romans would meet the same fate they wished for him, a reply Maximinus failed to grasp, still unaware of the exposed assassination plot. Then, turning on Bigulaus with fury, Attila accused him of breaking the treaty by coming before the return of all Hun fugitives. Bigulaus protested that no fugitives remained, but Attila's rage only grew. He berated him as a shameless creature who would have been impaled and left for the birds if not for the protection of his office. Calling on his secretaries, Attila had the names of missing Huns read aloud and insisted that many still lived within Roman territory. He ordered Bigulaus to leave and declared that he would send Esla, an old envoy of Rua, back with him to Constantinople to secure final agreement on the return of all defectors since the days when Carpilio, son of Aetius, had been a hostage. Attila would not allow men he called his slaves to serve in the Roman army. Grimly, he added that even if they did, they would be of little use when war returned. War which he assured them would come unless every deserter was restored. With that, he dismissed the Romans, instructing Maximinus not to leave Hun lands until an answer arrived to the emperor's letter. Thus ended the first tense audience. Apart from his unlucky greeting, Maximinus had spoken almost nothing. Back in their tent, the Roman envoys discussed the harsh words they had just endured. Bigulaus could not understand why Attila had treated him with such anger, since on an earlier occasion, when he had accompanied Anatolius, the Hun leader had received him calmly. Priscus suggested that Attila must have heard of his tactless remark during the dinner at Sardica, when he had spoken of Theodosius as a god, and reduced Attila to the rank of a mere man. Maximinus thought the same. but Bigilus remained unsettled. While they spoke, Edeco appeared and called Bigilus outside. Still pretending loyalty to the plot, he reminded the interpreter that he must bring out from Constantinople the 50 pounds of gold that had been promised for his followers. Once gone, Bigilus returned to say that Edeco, too, had suffered from Attila's anger over the fugitives. Soon after, messengers from the Hun leader arrived with strict orders. The Romans were to buy nothing in Hun territory except food until every dispute had been resolved. This rule was a dangerous trap for Bigilus. If he returned with Esla to Constantinople, knowing he could not legally purchase anything in Hun lands, how could he explain away such a large quantity of gold when it was brought out to Edeco? The envoys also declared that Maximinus must remain in Attila's dominions until Onegesius returned to camp. Onegesius, brother of Scotta and second only to Attila in power, had been sent away to establish Elik, Attila's eldest son, as ruler of the Acatsiri. While Maximinus waited, Bigilus set out for Constantinople, convinced that the assassination plot would succeed if only he could bring back the gold. The following day, the Huns broke camp and moved northward. The Romans, however, were led by another route, for Attila planned to visit a village where he intended to marry the daughter of a man named Escam. Their journey carried them across wide plains and several rivers, though their names are now forgotten. They passed through villages, stopped at a lake where a violent storm nearly destroyed their belongings, and were welcomed in a settlement ruled by one of Bleda's widows. She offered food and, as a sign of hospitality, presented them with women, whom they declined. In return, they gave her gifts: 3 silver cups, furs, Indian pepper, dates, and other goods prized among the nomads. 7 days later, their guides halted them at a village so Attila's great cavalcade could pass ahead. Here, the Eastern envoys encountered ambassadors from the Western Empire. Among them was Romulus, father-in-law to Orestes, one of Attila's Roman-born lieutenants, and future father of the boy who would reign as the last Western emperor. With him came Promotus, governor of Noricum, Romanus, an army officer, Tatulus, Orestes' father, and Constantius, secretary sent by Aetius himself. After Attila had ridden past, the two groups of ambassadors continued together until they reached the headquarters of the nomads. It was the largest settlement the Romans had yet seen, placed in the middle of a treeless plain, ideal for cavalry maneuvers and impossible to surprise. Attila's houses stood on a natural mound, built of polished wood and surrounded by a palisade decorated with towers, not for defense, but for display. A second palisade enclosed the dwellings of Onegesius. Among them stood a striking stone bathhouse, constructed by a Roman architect captured when Sirmium had fallen years earlier. He had hoped to win freedom by building it, but instead remained enslaved, now serving as bath attendant to Onegesius and his friends. When Attila rode into the village, the Romans witnessed a display of ceremonial splendor. Lines of young women stood beneath white linen canopies, singing in the Hun tongue as he passed. Onegesius' wife stepped forward with her attendants, offering delicacies and a silver goblet of wine. Attila accepted the gifts, tasted them from horseback, and rode on toward his own enclosure, leaving the ambassadors housed with Onegesius. He had just returned from his failed attempt to install Elik as king of the Acatsiri, for the prince had broken his wrist during the journey. His wife received the Romans warmly, and they later pitched their tents near Attila's palisade, ready to be summoned. The next day, Maximinus sent Priscus to present the gifts intended for Onegesius and inquire when they might meet Attila again. As Priscus waited at the gates of his palisade, he was greeted in Greek by a man who outwardly looked like a Hun. This startled him, for Greek was rarely heard in the camp except from ragged prisoners dragged from Thrace or Illyricum. The man before him, however, was neatly dressed, with the distinct style of the ruling Huns. Curious, Priscus asked who he was and how he came to live among the nomads. The man laughed and admitted he was Greek by birth. The conversation that followed proved so extraordinary and so revealing that Priscus later recorded it in full. A glimpse into the strange intersections of cultures on the frontier of Rome and the Huns. When the gates of Onegesius' enclosure finally opened, Priscus was ushered inside and, after a short wait, introduced to Attila's powerful lieutenant. Onegesius received the gifts politely and promised to call upon Maximinus. Soon after, he entered the Roman ambassador's tent, thanked him for the presents, and asked what service was required. Speaking on behalf of Theodosius, Maximinus urged him to travel to Constantinople, where he could negotiate a settlement of all disputes. Such an act, he said, would bring lasting honor to Onegesius and secure friendship with the emperor for himself and his descendants. Onegesius, however, immediately rejected the suggestion. Was he being asked to betray Attila and abandon his family, his wives, and his homeland? He would never do so, he declared, for it was better to live as a servant under Attila than as a wealthy man among the Romans. With that, he withdrew, proving himself even less pliable than Edeco. The next day, Priscus carried gifts to Attila's wife, Herica, mother of Elec, which allowed him to see the interior of Attila's fortified compound. Passing through a crowd of nomads, he entered her tent and found her reclining on a rug spread across the felt-covered floor. Her handmaid sat before her, embroidering colored threads into linen garments for the Huns. The interview was brief. Priscus greeted her, presented the gifts, and departed. Outside, he wandered freely through the camp, for the guards now recognized him and did not interfere. Hoping to encounter Onegesius, he lingered, but instead found himself swept up in the commotion that followed Attila's appearance. The Hun leader strode arrogantly from his dwelling, listening to the disputes of his people, dispensing rough justice in front of the crowd, and then returning inside to meet an embassy from another barbarian nation. While waiting, Priscus spoke with the envoys from the Western Empire. They asked if Maximinus was being detained or dismissed, and Priscus admitted he did not yet know. Their conversation turned to Attila's fierce temper. Romulus, leader of the Western delegation, and a man Priscus greatly respected, declared that Attila would no longer hear any request unless it served his own advantage. No one, he said, had ever ruled the Scythians, or any people, with such rapid success. He believed Attila now aimed to march against Persia, and that nothing would prevent him from reaching it. Some present even hoped he would indeed turn eastward, giving Rome a respite. Others, however, feared that the fall of Persia would only doom the empire, for Attila would not permit an independent Rome once he had crushed the Persians. The recent discovery of the so-called Sword of the War God seemed to signal that his power was destined to grow even greater. At last, Onegesius reappeared. The Romans approached, but he brushed them aside, speaking instead to his followers. Then he asked Priscus about the possibility of sending an ambassador of consular rank. Which man, he wanted to know, would likely be dispatched. Priscus carried the question back to Maximinus, who replied that the government wished Onegesius himself to come to Constantinople, but if that were impossible, they would send any envoy the Huns might choose. This response seemed important to Onegesius, who immediately summoned Maximinus to Attila. Priscus was not admitted, but when Maximinus returned, he reported that Attila had demanded the presence of one of 3 men, Nomus, Anatolius, or Senator, who had previously dealt with him. He would accept no others, and hinted that refusal would mean war. That evening, word arrived from Tatulus, the father of Orestes, that Attila required their attendance at a banquet. At the appointed hour, the Eastern and Western Romans gathered at the entrance to the hall within Attila's compound. According to custom, they were offered drink before being seated. Priscus then observed the setting. Along the side stood the chairs for Attila's warriors and guests. At the center, facing the entrance, was Attila's own couch. Behind it stood another, empty, and above both, on a raised dais, a bed screened with embroidered curtains. It became clear that Attila, unlike Roman rulers, slept in the very hall where he feasted. At the banquet, the place of honor beside Attila was given to Onagesios, the most influential man after the Hun leader himself. On Attila's left sat Bericus, with the Roman envoys seated next to him. 2 of Attila's sons sat before their father, their eyes lowered in fear. When all were seated, a wine-bearer entered and offered a goblet to Attila. He raised it in a toast to Bericus, who immediately stood, as custom demanded, and drank before handing the cup back. Each guest then repeated the same ritual, including the Romans, who toasted Attila in turn. Tables were set, one for every 3 or 4 men, piled with meat, bread, and delicacies served on silver taken from Roman cities. To the Romans it seemed a fine banquet, but they noted with surprise that Attila ate plainly. His plate and cup were wooden, and he ate only meat. Unlike his richly adorned followers, he wore simple shoes without jewels, and carried no sword at his side. His austerity stood in stark contrast to the splendor of those around him. When the meal ended, torches were lit, and 2 Huns stepped forward to sing songs celebrating Attila's victories. Their voices stirred different emotions among the guests. Some listened with joy, others grew restless as they recalled past wars, and older warriors wept, their strength long since gone. The mood then shifted again as a madman was brought in, shouting nonsense that provoked wild laughter. After him came Zerko, the dwarf once owned by Bleda. Having lost his wife when he was forced to the west, he had returned in hopes of regaining her. Dressed in a comical costume and speaking in a jumble of Latin, Gothic, and Hunnic, he kept the hall roaring with laughter. Yet Attila himself sat unmoved, his expression cold and stern. Then, as the laughter echoed, the youngest son of Attila, Ernak, entered the hall. He walked to his father's side, and for the first time Priscus saw the fierce leader's face soften. Attila gently stroked the boy's cheek, a gesture of tenderness he never showed his other sons. Curious, Priscus asked a Hun beside him what it meant. The man, after swearing him to secrecy, explained that soothsayers had foretold that Attila's line would fall but be restored through Ernak. The Romans were struck by this revelation. The banquet went on until dawn, but they withdrew earlier, unwilling to join in the endless drinking. The next morning they informed Onagesius that they wished to leave, believing their mission had reached its end. Permission was quickly granted, since the Romans had agreed to Attila's demand regarding future envoys. A letter was drafted for Theodosius, written down by Rusticius. That day the Romans were entertained again by Attila's wife Herica, along with some of his leading men, and were offered wine, each cup followed by an embrace and kiss from their Hun hosts. On the following evening another banquet was held, though less eventful than the first. This time the place of honor beside Attila was given to his uncle Ubarcius, who was still alive, though much younger than Attila's late brothers Rua and Oktar. During the meal, Attila spoke directly with Maximinus, pressing the claim of his Roman secretary Constantius, who wished to marry the daughter of a wealthy man named Saturninus. The discussion was long and tedious, leaving the ambassador little patience. 3 days later, the Romans were given gifts and set out on their return journey to Constantinople, accompanied by Bericus, who had been appointed to deliver messages and collect his own rewards. Along the way, they witnessed grim scenes of Hun justice. In one village, a captured Roman spy was about to be impaled, and in another they saw 2 Hun slaves crucified for murdering their masters. Bericus, at first amiable, grew distant and quarrelsome once they crossed the Danube. He demanded back the horse he had given Maximinus and refused to ride or eat with the envoys. Only when they reached Constantinople did he reveal his anger. Maximinus had told him that powerful German generals like Aspar and Ariobindus had lost influence at court, and this slight to his allies had enraged him. Nevertheless, the embassy returned home safely by a different route, passing through Philippopolis and Adrianople. In the end, Maximinus and his companions had conducted an almost impossible mission with remarkable tact, composure, and dignity. As Maximinus and Priscus made their way from Philippopolis to Adrianople, they encountered Baegilas the interpreter, who was heading back to Attila's settlement with the 50 pounds of gold he believed would bribe Edeco's men to assassinate their leader. After a brief exchange about what had taken place after his departure, Baegilas continued on, unaware that the plot had already been exposed and that he was walking into a trap. When he finally reached Attila, he was immediately arrested. The gold was seized, and Attila demanded to know why he was carrying such a large sum. Baegilas gave a prepared explanation. He said the money was meant to buy food for himself and his servants, to replace any worn-out animals during the long journey, and to ransom Roman captives whose relatives had entrusted him with funds. Attila thundered back that no excuses would save him, for the amount was far too large to be justified by these reasons, and besides, ransoming prisoners had already been forbidden. Baegilas had foolishly brought his young son with him, and Attila ordered that the boy be put to the sword unless his father revealed the truth. Overcome with despair, Baegilas begged that the punishment fall upon him instead of his innocent child. In the end, he confessed everything: the conspiracy between Edeco, Chrysaphius, and the emperor himself. Attila, already informed by Edeco, knew the confession was genuine. He placed Baegilas in chains, but spared his son, sending him back to Constantinople with Orestes and Esla. The boy was to return with another 50 pounds of gold to ransom his father. Attila instructed Orestes to wear the purse that had carried the original gold and show it to the emperor and Chrysaphius, demanding if they recognized it. Esla was given a sharp message to deliver. Theodosius's father Arcadius had been noble, and Attila's own father Mundiach had been noble as well. Yet while Attila had preserved his father's virtues, Theodosius had disgraced his lineage by becoming a slave to Attila, paying tribute but plotting against his master in secret like a treacherous servant. Theodosius would only be forgiven if Chrysaphius were handed over for punishment. This demand came at the very moment when Chrysaphius's enemies in the empire were also seeking his destruction. Zeno the Isaurian, who had defended Constantinople in the crisis of 447, had risen to great power and was now master of the soldiers in the east. He set himself against Chrysaphius. The tension grew worse when Attila's Roman secretary Constantius, to whom the emperor had promised the daughter of a wealthy man named Saturninus, was denied his bride. Zeno had abducted the woman and given her in marriage to one of his own men, Rufus. Constantius complained bitterly to Attila, who then insisted during his banquet with Maximinus that the secretary must receive another bride of equal wealth and standing. Attila went further, suggesting that if Theodosius could not recover the woman from Zeno, he himself would gladly join the emperor in an alliance to destroy the Isaurian commander. What might have happened had Theodosius agreed to such an extraordinary plan, we cannot say, but the proposal hints at how far Attila's influence reached. Zeno's interference appears to have been aimed solely at undermining Chrysaphius. The emperor retaliated by confiscating the bride's property, which Zeno had hoped to secure for Rufus. Convinced Chrysaphius was behind this act, Zeno began demanding the eunuch's death, echoing Attila's call for his execution. With threats closing in from both outside and within, Chrysaphius decided to appease the more dangerous enemy first. Attila had already declared he would only negotiate with Anatolius, Nomus, or Senator. The government yielded, and Chrysaphius chose Anatolius and Nomus. Their task was to calm Attila's fury and persuade him to uphold the peace of 448, while promising that Constantius would be given another wife of noble birth and wealth. They were also to explain that among the Romans, no woman could be forced to marry against her will, a custom Attila likely found strange. To ensure Attila's goodwill, Chrysaphius personally sent a sum of gold. In the spring of 450, Anatolius and Nomus crossed the Danube, bringing with them the son of Bigilus and the extra gold to free his father. Attila rode south as far as the river Drecken to meet them. Though he greeted them with arrogance, their rich gifts and careful diplomacy soon softened his stance. They achieved remarkable success. Attila swore to maintain the peace under the conditions of the 448 treaty, to drop his demands concerning fugitives already sheltered in Roman lands, and most importantly, to withdraw from the great strip of territory south of the Danube he had previously forced the Romans to abandon. Bigilus was released, the demand for Chrysaphius' life was dropped, and Attila even freed many Roman captives without ransom. As a gesture of goodwill, he also presented the envoys with horses and furs. Constantius accompanied them back to the empire to claim his promised bride, and Theodosius arranged for him to marry a wealthy widow of noble rank, the daughter-in-law of the former General Plintha. With this union secured, the agreement was sealed. The Third Treaty of Anatolius was a triumph for the Eastern government, giving the empire a rare respite from the Hun menace. In the early summer of 450, many must have believed that peace on the northern frontier was finally secure. Yet fate had other plans. On July 26th, while hunting near the river Lycus not far from his capital, Theodosius fell from his horse and suffered a broken spine. 2 days later, the emperor was dead.